that are substituting for some members. So apologies have been received from Gareth Bacon, Deputy Chairman, whom Sean Bailey AM is substituting, from Tom Copley, from Keith Prince, for whom Tony Devonish AM is substituting, and from Stephen O'Connell AM, whom Andrew Boff is substituting. Have I missed anything? I'm almost exhausted before we started the meeting now. If I can then move on to item 2, declarations of interest. Can we note the list of officers held by Assembly members? Members are asked to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest in specific items listed on the agenda and declare any other relevant interests. Are there any? We should point out, Tony Devonish, you are the constituency member for the for one of the boroughs.
I am, and I should probably also declare I'm a Westminster councillor, so I was indirectly involved in the incident. Okay,
thank you very much. Then moving on to 3, in terms of the minutes, can we confirm the meetings of the meeting on the 11th of October 2017 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Can we move on to summary list of actions? Can we note the actions from our previous meetings?
Noted.
And then can we welcome to item 5, which is the response of London Resilience to the Grenfell Tower Fire. Welcome our guests. We've got Barry Quirk, Chief Exec of Kensington and Chelsea, John Barradell, Town Clerk and Chief Executive from the City of London Corporation, Doug Patterson, Chief Executive of Bromley, Eleanor Kelly, Chief Executive of Southwark, and David Bellamy, the Mayor's Chief of Staff here at the GLA. Can I welcome you all? We've got a number of formal questions, but there may well be some questions that arise from your answers that members will wish to pursue. We will try and be as clear as we can, and if you can be as concise as you can. And we know there's a background of a public inquiry into these events that have happened. It is not our role to pinpoint culpability about agencies or individuals, but we do want and seek assurances about matters of concern that arose from the tragedy in the immediate aftermath, in the post-recovery period, if I can call it that, those issues. So if I can begin then with question 1, and I suppose, John, I'm going to direct it to you, but you might well be supported by other colleagues. Can you just describe the role of how you see it, your resilience partnership, but also can you walk us through what was the role in the immediate aftermath of the fire and what the timelines were, and just take us through to where, bring us up to date on how that works.
Thank you, Chair, and if I could take a couple of minutes with the committee just to do some introductory remarks, it may help set a context here. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today regarding those activities following the tragic fire at Grenfell, and to talk through the responsibilities of the various agencies, particularly the local authority gold arrangements and how they worked. If I could say that, first of all, my role is as chair of the local authority panel. The panel comprises of chief executives who take a leadership role in resilience across London. And as a result of that, I'm also deputy chair of the London Resilience Partnership, which is chaired by one of the deputy mayors. And as such, clearly was involved and have been involved with resilience for a number of years. The second piece I'd like to say is that the incidents that take place within London are managed within a context of previously arranged protocols and agreements between local authorities. Those have been tested this year 7 times on 7 different occasions of varying degrees of involvement across London, and are based upon the concept of mutual support. These arrangements go back a long time. They predate 2004, they predate 1960, they actually go back to the 1950s in terms of looking at the risk of flooding in London and how local authorities would work together to address those issues. So there is a long involved history of local authorities working together and sharing expertise and staff that has been tested on a number of occasions, and as I say, 7 times so far this year. As you've mentioned, there will be a public inquiry by Sir Martin Mulbeck into the events, particularly in the context of this committee, the events that followed the fire and the responses from the various agencies, including local authorities, to that, and the support provided to the survivors, the families, and the local area as well. In total, over 500 local authority staff were involved across London. That excludes Kensington and Chelsea's own staff and central government staff and the voluntary sector in the response to Grenfell. In terms of supporting not only the residents and the bereaved families, but also the infrastructure support, the current work still going on the site of the tower itself. So 500 is a significant contribution, I think, from every London borough over the time. In total, we had 9 local authority chief executives directly involved. They were used to lead various work strands during the recovery part of the process to bring the expertise and the ability to direct resource and understand how these pieces work. The activation of the arrangement, as I think you'll be aware from your previous hearings, took place on Friday afternoon, although clearly we were monitoring and watching events around Grenfell and in Kensington and Chelsea from the get-go, from the early hours of Wednesday morning. I think I'll leave it there. If there are any more specific questions, clearly we can go into the detail of that.
And the activation for your involvement, and we understand from the protocols, and we were clear last time was, and we've got some questions later on, but I just want to be clear in our own mind before we leave this question, is around whether the local authority asked for mutual aid from the wider local government family. Is that where it is in terms of what you think the protocols are?
So, events that would take place within an individual borough, as this was, and indeed a number of events earlier in the year were of a similar type. Croydon tram crash earlier, a few years ago, was in this context as well. The local authority involved would request mutual aid. It would be offered, and that happened in this case, as far as I'm aware. If the incident gets to a level where clearly there needs to be wider support, particularly around leadership, and bearing in mind the length of time these go on, then there is an ability for those authorities to request that from elsewhere, as indeed happened on Friday in this instance.
Now, we are going to go back into that period of time, if we say from that first week of recovery until that point where you kick in terms of that what mutual work. And we might well be quoting from some documents, but we'll pick that up during questions. The members content, can I continue on, or does anyone want to come in? Okay, right, let's move on then. I think these questions could be, I think from back to Barry, John, Doug or Eleanor, so chip in as you want to, as you do. So at our last meeting, we heard that the London resilience arrangements, such as the meeting of the Strategic Coordination Group, SGC, was triggered by various protocols and plans, so brought the partner agencies together in the immediate aftermath of the fire. What's your assessment of how those arrangements worked? So let's take it from, let's say, Fire Brigade finish early hours of the morning. They're still convening at something like 8 o'clock. A number of you in local government, as in terms of resilience group, have been contacted in the early hours of the morning whilst the fire is still continuing. Kensington and Chelsea have taken responsibility for their bits. I think that's fair to say. So take us through that bit and then take us from the Friday afternoon bit. If we look at those two distinct bits, it would be helpful. Yep.
Yeah. So at 4:58, I believe the first message came to me in terms of the London Local Authority Gold arrangement. So literally a couple of minutes before 5 o'clock, informing that there was an incident, because clearly at the time I was elsewhere and not in London as it happens. But there was an incident and a strategic coordinator group was going to be held, involving and led by obviously the Fire Brigade, Metropolitan Police and the local authority, Gold represented by people from Steve Ham's team at that time in the morning. So that was the first point at which it became obvious an incident to us had happened, the first formal event. In terms of subsequent to that, there are a number of strategic coordinating groups that took place. We weren't involved in those. I personally wasn't involved in those. Although on Friday morning I did sit in on a telephone conversation, a telephone strategic coordinating group on the Friday morning, as I say.
Okay. So if we go to you, Barry, then that period between from the not the early hours, so at 5 o'clock we're all told. Then you move on. So what did KNC do?
Well, I cannot give you any account of that because I wasn't in post at the time.
Right.
I joined them on secondment from Lewisham in late June, What happened was I attended a couple of meetings the following week to give management advice. And on the third day that I was there, it was clear that the then Chief Executive was resigning. And so I then agreed at the end of June, at the suggestion of both the Local Government Association and the government officials, to be an interim Chief Executive there. So I can't give a first-hand account of what happened in those first few days. I wasn't even present in Kensington and Chelsea until the following week.
I think it's fair to say in those first few days there were concerns emerging. We know concerns are emerging amongst experts, and we know that concerns were emerging amongst certainly the victims and survivors, and certainly from the media, about what was taking place in those couple of days. So I think do any of you want to comment on that, about what the emerging discussions were? We've got some questions, specific questions around that, but can you confirm that the experts, if I can call you that, were talking about different responses with either KNC or amongst yourself, albeit you weren't directly involved in that period of time? Because that's what, in terms of the evidence we had at our first hearing, that's what we were being told. Is that correct?
From my perspective, there was, clearly we were watching what was happening and trying to assist with what was happening in Kensington and Chelsea. Staff were working in KNC, and a couple of people directly working with us were involved. And we were getting reports back of how those operations, how those events were taking place, the structures being put in place and the support being provided. And it was quite clear that the escalation of the demand, if I can put it that way, on public services, it gives an indication, I think, of the fact 500 around London were involved fairly quickly in this, of the scale of event and the scale of impact on the local community was significant, and I think was appreciated more and more as events took place over the following days. And that is why I believe the activation of the arrangements took place. The need to put more resource in, to put more support in around Kensington and Chelsea. Okay. And everyone, I think, Chair, looked at the news and saw this scale of what was going on in the local area.
Chair, if I may add a comment to that. So by then, from the immediate of the event, Bromley and other boroughs were putting staff in, were making offers of help and support to K&C. And in terms of the preparedness from the chief executives, so I'm sitting out on a Thursday evening, I got a call from John saying, this is cranking up, are you in if we need some help? And that was where it was, and that's sort of getting prepared for what was coming, or anticipating what was coming. Thank you.
And was the tragedy was at the higher end, wasn't it? I mean, in terms of the magnitude, the numbers we're dealing with, the numbers of survivors, the number of people that needed support were considerable. I now want to talk, you correct me if I'm wrong, because I just want it in my own mind, just want to be clear. So let's say 5 o'clock, the London Resilience Group starts to gather information and the type of support that might well be needed. It's early stages yet, but that's what sort of exercise would be going on. You'll be talking amongst yourself, talking to colleagues in KNC, talking to emergency services. We then have, you tell me, when do the strategic coordination protocols are enacted? They're almost enacted by virtually KNC saying, we're taking the lead in this aftermath, we're still talking to you, we don't think we need any help, we think we can deal with it ourselves. Is that when that protocol is enacted? Is that immediately at 5 o'clock, or is that at some other specific time?
The lead authority at the beginning would have been the authority dealing with the incident, which was at the beginning the London Fire Brigade, and the chairing of the strategic group moved to the police, I think, on the second meeting, if memory's right. I have to say, Chair, I wasn't there, so I'm going on what I've been told subsequently. After that, when events moved from response, which clearly was still going on during the course of Wednesday, it would transfer across to the recovery phase. The two do run, I think, as you've heard before, almost inevitably in parallel, with humanitarian assistance needed, obviously, during the response phase, dealing with the incident phase as well. And that would then transfer to the local authority function. If I could be a little bit clear as well, on each of the 33 local authority chief executives in London participate in a rota whereby one of them is on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and has a second chief executive standing by as what we call the second. Okay? The person for those two, as I think you heard before, was transferring and switching the following day, However, the continuity piece is provided with briefing, and I think we had evidence from Steve Ham about that earlier on. So there is always a chief exec on duty. The scale of this was quite evident, and therefore the more senior, if I can put it that way, the more experienced chief execs did understand, as indeed Doug has mentioned, that we would almost certainly be called in by K&C and would need to provide significant support to them.
Okay. And given that we haven't got K&C's account, sorry, Barry, do you want to come
I
in?
just wanted to add that
Yeah.
although I wasn't there, I've made sure that the head of audit, who had himself arrived after, both locked down and got all of the information and ensured that that information is now with the inquiry, which is the detailed minute by minute, hour by hour chronology at that time.
And would I be right in thinking then, so we've got the local authority resilience group working alongside, doing some work in case there's a request for mutual aid and understanding what that is. We've got K&C in terms of coordinating those issues. I would be right in expecting, because we don't know exactly when it was, that they would be convening their own meetings within their borough immediately. Is that what that would be? So running parallel with the London Resilience Group, K&C would be coordinating meetings within their own resources, their own agencies, within their borough to work out how they need to support the survivors. Okay, right, and during that time. Okay, right. Can I just keep running through, just in my own mind? So we get to the situation of Friday, which I think becomes much clearer. And Friday, we move in to support K&C. Is that fair to say? Against that background that I said earlier on, even government raising questions about the nature of the support given to people. Okay, so then we run from Friday, and then we get to a situation where I'm a bit hazy around the government task force that's put in. So we're working, and then there's a government task force that's working. Is that much later when we finish working and there's a different recovery phase, or is it a continuum of the work that goes through?
I think, Chair, it's exactly the same. I think a different set of words was used to describe the arrangements that are London local government and arrangements within City Hall that are put in place. I think the language was used to describe something that already existed.
Okay, right, okay, good. Right, I think then we've got all the different bits that I think in our own mind, so we can then move, and I'll take colleagues. So, Sian Berry.
Just a couple of questions about the actual handover process to you becoming the triggering process for London Local Authority Gold, which meant you could actually go in and act as the chief executive, effectively, of Kensington and Chelsea. I think, and I'm trying to find the reference, that we were previously told that happened on Friday morning, but you said Friday afternoon. So I wanted to check the exact time that you were able to spend their resources to take charge.
So that would be Friday afternoon.
What time did that happen?
It was clear that would have been at 2 o'clock, I believe.
So you were able to do some work on Friday?
Exactly. I mean, I was physically present in K&C on Friday morning, but clearly part of it is allowing K&C to chair the final meetings, to understand the processes that they've got in place, and then to take over afterwards.
So what was the delay? Because, I mean, as far as I understand it, on Thursday night, they decided they were going to do this. Is there paperwork? What actually has to happen?
There is a request that needs to be made that they wish the arrangement to be put in place.
In writing?
No, it's verbal. It can be done. It can be done verbally. Okay. It can be done verbally. It can be done verbally.
And then before you can actually take over, there is a delay of some hours.
I think it is worth, Chair, if I can, just clarifying the role. The role here is not command and control of asset at this stage. The role here is coordinating a response. The responsibility for that is still with the local borough. This is about coordinating and providing support, encouragement, and, if you will, advice, and the coordinating role of the function. The spending of money, frankly, was already happening by K&C. They were already spending the cash. This was more about the coordinating and stepping in to check and to start validating the plans that have been put in place. Was there mutual aid in place? And so on.
So that's leadership with the ability to direct resources, but
yes,
less so than taking over entirely.
It's not quite a police command and control system.
Great. The other question I have is potentially, possibly for Barry, is how many staff from Kensington and Chelsea were mobilised initially to the scene before all this happened, before the transfer?
I actually don't know that information, but I do because I do know how many are mobilised now, and I know how many we're mobilising, but I don't know what the issues was at the time. I arrived, as I say, late the following week, and I took over Kensington and Chelsea's management arrangements like 10 days after that. So I actually can't say with authority this is the number that were present on the day. I do know, I've spoken to many staff who were present on the day, so I do know that people were mobilised, and I know that when I arrived they were having daily gold meetings, which I took over and changed the focus of them and the urgency about them. But I can't give first-hand account of what was happening on those first few days.
Can we find that out?
I wonder if you could find out that information, pass it back to us.
Yes.
Can you just go, you have to be polite and speak in a different language than maybe I have to. But the Friday intervention, if I can call it that, because it's intervention by another name, whether it's supportive and leading, the number of chief execs involved almost says if K&C hadn't asked for help and support, then someone else was going to make sure it got in there. Because could you envisage carrying on in the maelstrom of both the media, victims, government questioning what was going on, mayor questioning what was going on, and allowing it to continue for more days around that? And I just, because I think it was a significant intervention on the Friday and a bit of a turnaround, albeit in very difficult circumstances with, the aftermath of the tragedy you were dealing with. So am I right to call it an intervention?
I think
it's
not language, Chair, I would use. I think it is
You're so
more...
polite, John. You're too
very kind.
polite.
I think it is more about us being able to be clear what the offer to Kensington and Chelsea was, of understanding that colleagues understood the scale now and were making offers of support to them that they really ought to be taking, and there was an ability to coordinate that being offered. I think that's a distinction I draw. Intervention has a very specific meaning, and one of the lessons, if I can say this to the committee, that we have, and indeed we've commissioned some work in London councils exactly around this point, is at how would you go about encouraging a borough who were not necessarily understanding the scale or indeed the support that was available to them to encourage them to go through an activation process. At the moment it's designed around boroughs asking and boroughs saying, please come and help. There are clear lessons here about activating it sooner and understanding the scale and the opportunity of support from elsewhere sooner. And it's a clear lesson that is being looked at. Externally, I have to say, to London as well, but I can come to that later if that's helpful.
Barry, you want to come in? But
Yeah,
before you come in, can I just ask, from your period in K&C, what were the deliberations in K&C asking for mutual support? Are you aware of those internal discussions at K&C?
No, not at all. Because I think that was just conversations between the former chief executive and I didn't speak to him about this. I was basically involved in the urgency of the moment. Look, I've worked in London local government since 1977, began in housing. This is the worst tragedy in London in my life. And the moral urgency of dealing with this seems to me to be what's driving all the London authorities to try to support and aid. I think it's absolutely critical that whatever the arrangements are, we look at them in detail, make sure we've got real lessons about how we act with greater urgency, greater pace. Because there's no question that more should be done, and we are doing this every day now. I mean, it's what energises people in Kensington and Chelsea now who work there. How can we improve the circumstances, the life chances? How can we make sure that those 71 people and the 64 families who are bereaved and the victims and the survivors actually are able to have adequate life chances, adequate life outcomes from this awful and appalling tragedy?
I do want to pursue this. If you can't give me the answers, I hope the public inquiry gets some answers from you.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? But I'm going to ask the Deputy Chief of Staff. So there were various COBRA meetings, which I understand was reported in the press where the government were raising concerns about the performance of local government. And I don't know if this be fair, because I think it was about local government, not just KNC at that time. What's your understanding of why the support mechanism for mutual aid issue kicked in on Friday? Am I correct in terms of those periods of days of where people were looking at this and saying, we can't continue in this way?
Firstly, as a technical point, they weren't technically COBRA meetings, they were ministerial meetings, although they did make use of COBRA facilities, and so there's been some, I think, public confusion about the terminology there. But originally, there were ministerial meetings on the Wednesday afternoon and the Thursday afternoon, chaired by the Police and Fire Minister, and then on the Friday, chaired by the Prime Minister, and then subsequently, I believe she chaired a meeting on the Saturday several times that week, and there's also an officials meeting on the Sunday. And the Mayor and myself were at all those meetings. I think it's fair to say that on the Wednesday, there's a lot of people currently getting their heads around things. I think the Mayor at the meeting on the Wednesday, asked a lot of questions and was pushing for a lot of action. The meeting on the Thursday, clearly the government was seized of the scale of the situation. The Minister and the Housing Minister had appeared before MPs. The committee will recall it wasn't done formally in the House because the appropriate processes for forming the new Parliament was still taking place following the general election, but a meeting of MPs was held at which those ministers spoke, and it was, I think, clear then the government ministers were very seized of the mood of their parliamentary colleagues and the need for action, and that was brought into that meeting. But clearly there was some evidence and some clearly I personally felt that matters were not proceeding on the ground as they needed to, given the scale of the situation. That then brought us to certainly Thursday evening. When I left there, I spoke to John, who confirmed that discussions to activate local authority gold arrangements were underway. And then the meeting chaired by the Prime Minister on Friday, which John, as he said, just assumed the role and was present on that meeting. To answer your previous question, I would say that had John not been in post, I think the Prime Minister would have wanted some action to be taken. It's a counterfactual as to what that might have been, but I think it was clear that a step needed to be taken, and clearly the activation of the mutual aid arrangements and John, supported by Chief Executive colleagues, coming into post was what was required to start addressing it.
Okay, right. I'm going to take some colleagues now. I think I saw Onka. I've seen Peter Whittle as well. Onka Sahuta. Do you want to?
In the resilience arrangements, when about did the NHS get involved? I mean, as this strategy was unfolding, there was obviously the immediate response by the hospital staff, but was a huge need for the NHS and the community services. At what stage does the NHS get involved in the resilience arrangements, and they are put on alert, right, that this is the magnitude of the tragedy that's unfolding, which will result in a huge amount of community service needs and also psychological and counselling support for the victims and the survivors. So when do they get involved in the whole scene?
If I can pick up two parts of that and then ask Eleanor maybe to comment a little bit more on it. There is a thing called the Humanitarian Assistance Plan that covers a lot of the areas which I think you were referring to. The NHS would have been, as a responder, I think as Steve would have said, involved right at the beginning in the strategic coordinating group. At the beginning, it would be the London Ambulance Service particularly would be involved at the very beginning of an incident of this type. And subsequent to that, the various NHS elements, be it Public Health England, be it the NHS local providers, CCG and so on, would have been part of that humanitarian assistance group and were.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Peter Whittle.
Yes, thank you. This is to Barry. Barry, I just want to press you a little bit on what my colleague, Assembly Member Berry asked. I'm just a little bit perplexed that you have no idea how many people went from KNC to Grenfell that day. You said you had no idea because you weren't there at the time. You know, I mean, you've had quite a long time, presumably knowing you were coming here as well today. Can you at least give us a sort of general, vague figure of how many people would have gone?
I don't think it would be. I mean, I will certainly circulate to the committee what the numbers. I shall go back and I shall ask the questions about that and make the best estimate I can. I have to say, most of the time I'm working. I have been since that the second, third week, working on making sure we've got adequate people on housing. I mean, I've hired another 250 staff to work on housing allocations and on the care for Grenfell, key social workers and so on. So I've been strengthening coordination, changing the organisation and making it more effective and organised in a different way, because this has really changed the nature of Kensington and Chelsea's budget in many ways and its organisation. If I give you an example, Kensington and Chelsea is probably the smallest borough in London. It only has 6,500 social housing tenants. At the time of the fire, 1 in 20 were in hotels. Because of the impact of this within a small borough with such a small social housing stock, meant that it was really unable to cope with that at the time. So it didn't have a housing department. It has a tenant management organisation, which is a managing agent that's run by the tenants, or a tenant organisation, tenant-led organisation. So it's a small organisation. We're desperately trying to rehouse people. We have a large, as does every other London borough, spend quite a big proportion of their money on children's social care and on adult social care and on homelessness. Now with Grenfell, we're now spending probably over 80% of our resource on targeted individuals. And so it's fundamentally changing the nature of Kensington and Chelsea as an authority over a very quick period. And I've had to reorganise and reset the organisation to take account of that and to work into the future, not pore over, well, what was the issues, how many were there on the Friday afterwards. I'm looking at how many care workers do we have for next week, for the week after? How many properties are we getting? We're purchasing 300 properties at the moment.
So, with respect, we are talking about that Friday.
I understand.
Sean, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, sorry, thank you, Peter. I think that gets at my question a bit better, actually. I mean, I'm a Camden councillor, and we had to evacuate 4 of our towers very suddenly, 3,000 people or so. Obviously, there was no tragedy, but there were an awful lot of people who needed practical support, and the council mobilised people. I'm certain I've seen the number of people who were mobilised from the council staff. Is it the case from what you've just been saying, though, that Kensington and Chelsea didn't have a lot of staff who were skilled in those things to draw upon? And was that something that maybe should have been known about as a risk, potentially, in the case of a lot of the humanitarian?
I don't want to give the impression it didn't mobilise staff. It did mobilise staff. Whether it mobilised enough is obviously
but with
a big
no
question.
housing department, for example.
Yes, it doesn't have a housing department. It doesn't have an internal housing department. And it's got small staffing. I mean, it has just 2,000 staff, whereas I do think Camden has closer to 5. So, you know, it's a different challenge. It's the biggest challenge, the worst tragedy in the smallest borough with the smallest social housing stock.
Yeah, I mean, in the context of what we're talking about, that potentially means that mutual aid should have been triggered maybe sooner, and there's another reason why, isn't it?
So this is just introductory questions. We're going to drill down further. So just to be clear with you, I don't want to be dishonest with you. Eleanor, did you want to come in at any points that you've heard?
I would have come in after David, but I think it actually addresses the point that Sean Berry's just made. I wouldn't want the committee to have the impression that we were just sort of like having a watching brief and sitting on our hands and waiting to see what happened. It's a fact that there is nothing in the resolution that allows us to step in or allows us to impose intervention in any borough. But as John said, that is something that the London Council's review may well look at. How can you accelerate it? But to go to the point that Doug made about the offers of help that were already being made, in relation to and what was happening in Kensington Chelsea at the time, on behalf of Southwark, I offered help at 6 o'clock on the Wednesday morning because we had experience of the Lackingall fire. And I knew that we knew, although it was on a much, much smaller scale, we knew how to step through it, and we knew both the short and the long-term implications. And so having made that offer, as a result of conversations during the course of the day between myself and the Chief Executive of Kensington and Chelsea and John and I, Kensington and Chelsea allowed me to send 2 of my strategic directors into the Gold meeting that they had on Thursday morning. One who was very experienced in relation to Gold arrangements and emergency planning, and one who is very experienced in relation to housing. Those officers reported back to John and John and I had the conversation, as David indicated, on the Thursday evening with the Chief Executive of Kensington and Chelsea, and in part with the result that on Friday they did actually invoke London Gold. So that's only sort of like one borough's experience of reaching out and being involved, both from a local authority point of view and my own borough's point of view, but also in relation to the way that the LAP arrangements kicked in, and that John and I were talking about this and talking to Kensington and Chelsea from the Wednesday.
So in series, on the series of conversations and being involved in meetings, I say intervention, you say support, but really a recognition by K&C that they couldn't cope. Yes or no?
Invoking the resolution means that you cannot cope on your own. Yeah. And there are formal and informal examples of the resolution being invoked since, as John said, since the resolution was sort of like set up in 2010, which made it London-wide. Previously, it was sub-regional. So in 2010, when this resolution was set up, made it London-wide, and that's a very important issue when you're looking at scale.
Sorry, Chairman, and the reason I hesitated around intervention was the scale of this became apparent over time. It was very clear at the beginning. It was an absolutely tragic event with people having lost lives, their homes, everything, and the impact on community. But the extent of that grew over the course of the next 48 hours, quite clearly. And the ability of the community itself to organise, to do donations, to manage their own response, as it were, became very evident over 48 hours. And at that point, any borough in London, in my belief, would have had to ask for support from elsewhere. And also bear in mind, the staff there had been on call, on duty, as it were, by then for 72 hours. So it's no surprise they'd be asking for support, at a very senior level as well, if nothing else, to be able to get some respite and recharge batteries. So it's no surprise to me that that happened. And I would say that any borough would have had an issue with the amount of demand that was placed on them. If I can say, the 500 number is an enormous number. Over 100 of those were social workers, and I'm sure we'll get into the wraparound support and so on. But that, again, exceeds the number of social workers in any individual borough, as far as I'm aware, in London, as well as current caseload that they would be dealing with.
Others want to come in at this point, or we proceed with the formal questions?
Wait to the drilling down, though.
We're going to drill down.
I just wanted to respond to that.
Yeah.
If I may.
Assembly Member Andrew Boff.
You're saying that the scale wasn't apparent for a considerable period of time. I'm finding that quite difficult to absorb. The scale was apparent
it's probably
very early on, was it not?
It's loose words. It's consequences of the event itself and the need for the complexity of the response that would have been required. So it was the setting up of the rest centre, the spontaneous volunteering that took place, the involvement of local churches, multiple sites. In the first 24 hours, for example, I think there were 4 rest centres running, okay, with individuals placed in individual rest centres, some staying with family and friends, some staying in hotels, some sleeping on floors. That is an incredibly complex position to try and bring some order to and some organised support to. So I think it was complexity rather than scale is probably a better use of words.
I can't see what would have been a better situation, if you want. I can't understand all those things you've mentioned. Surely automatic from hundreds of people suddenly losing their homes, irrespective of the deaths and everything. But you know, this session is not considering that. Surely that must have been known quite early on, that if a couple of hundred people are suddenly made homeless, instantly homeless, that there will be that kind of scale of response required.
As I said, I think the word scale was probably not the appropriate word. Complexity. I think the complexity here, though, is also to do with community, to do with community infrastructure, to do with, as Barry talked about, the scale of the local authority, the time of day, etc., all played a part in increasing the complexity of this over time. Thank you.
Chair, through you, just to illustrate that, we've had much higher numbers of households having to be immediately evacuated all across London, for example, as a result of unexploded World War II bombs. And the vast majority of those incidents have always sort of like passed very well without a crisis situation, if you like, in relation to sort of like housing them either overnight in rest centres or in hotels and so forth. So there is an issue about absolutely the complexity and the community response, the impact on the community of this terrible tragedy unfolding in front of people's eyes actually massively increased the humanitarian assistance required in the area over and above the impact of a tragic fire impacting on 151 properties. It was of much more complexity, and that therefore gave it much more scale than the 151 properties that were destroyed, plus the people from the walkway blocks who had to be evacuated from within the cordon.
Can I go on to my next question?
Oh, that's fine. If you just hold on a moment, because we're going to go to Navin, but Sean Bailey wants to come in. We're doing an aspect of Navin's questions. Sean, very quickly.
Just quickly, I have to agree with my colleagues here, because obviously any particular disaster has a perceived level of complexity with it, but surely somebody on the ground at your very high level will have known that this would have been a very particular case because it was permanently excluded from your home. To use your example, in a bomb, unexploded bomb, at some point you're going back. Surely someone would have realised this particular borough, smallest borough, has been mentioned before, are going to have 200 plus families who are permanently needing of housing. I don't understand how the scale or the complexity, whichever word you used, was not perceived almost immediately. For me, there's a failure there. Who assesses these things? Who looks at what the recovery stage is going to look like?
I understand the point of the question. I think the piece for me here is these events don't happen in isolation on an exercise table in a room somewhere. They happen to real communities with real backgrounds and real history and real people's lives being lost. And for me, the complexity increased because we didn't appreciate at a distance, nor would we, the local community makeup, the relationships within that community, and how they worked. And that wasn't going to be apparent unless you were physically present on the ground and had history in that community. And I think the point on, I do accept Mr. Boss, but it is not, scale was the wrong word to use. Scale to me was the response scale rather than the scale in the community, if you see what I mean. And the complexity plays an enormous part of that. And it's not something, unless you're in the community, truly you'd understand. And I think what happened here was we began to understand as outsiders the impact on that community over the first 72 hours. And it became very evident it was far more complex, far more impacting on that community than at first sight from outside.
Well, in some ways, I think some of the complexities about the protocols we're following, the fact of early intervention and support of the local government family, we may have got to grips much earlier than 72 hours of understanding the complexity and the issues. So we've heard earlier on much that, loss of life and that immediate aftermath impacting on the tragedy. The Camden experience at the weekend after of that substantial number is, in terms of recovery, putting them in old places of holding and then moving them on. in terms of providing that support. Okay, we haven't got the tragedy of loss of life and near-death experience for the survivors, but they are basic bread and butter issues of resilience planning, emergency planning, that you're telling me through your answers there was a picture emerging of, in terms of the capabilities of an authority to deal with this issue or to recognise very early on it needed help and support. And I think that's where we are.
In summary, who needed to, for that scale to have been realised, who needed to be in the room or it needed to be in those meetings of the SCG to allow them to realise what the complexity was?
I think that goes back to the question the Chair asked at the beginning in terms of part of the lessons learned here, of the need to understand at what point and what levers do you have to say to an authority, actually the scale is so big, you're dealing in the minutiae, you're dealing locally, you need to understand we're here to help and we can assist in doing that. And it's the activation of the protocol, it's the activation of the local authority mutual aid, which is one of the lessons from here, because it could have been done differently and probably should, in retrospect, have been done differently. And that's one of the things we've asked an outside set of chief executives and others to look at, so we learn the lessons from that.
Yeah, may I add to this and say, I think that this bringing in chief executives from outside London to scrutinise what we've done, to look at what we've done, how we've done it, I think it's absolutely important for broader assurance. It's not just the risk and the incident, it's the organisation's capacity and capability to deal with it. And that varies enormously across London. You have a London-wide perspective. The individual authorities have their own perspective. And I would say going from Lewisham to Kensington and Chelsea, there was less capacity and capability because there's less social housing, much less, and therefore less ability, and the organisation is smaller. And so I do think there is this both about the risk, but also about the organisations that are their capability of actually doing this, which is the numbers of, not just the numbers of staff, but the properties that are available.
Okay.
There are only 2% turnover in social housing in Kensington and Chelsea. It's 9% in Lewisham. 2% of like 6,500 means about 200 a year.
With all due respect, Barry, but that tells me, I'm a layperson, I'm not even in your roles, I wouldn't even dream of wanting to be a chief exec of a London borough, but that tells me that I need help and support. Much quicker. I don't need to wait for a long time to work out that there's some problems here. But equally, against the background of that 72 hours, I'm telling government is telling you that they think something's wrong. I'm sitting watching TV thinking something's not going quite right. As a person looking quite inside, not being following, I'm sceptical what I see on the media after times, but from the information being provided through the TV and watching from afar, the victims and survivors are saying it's not right. And somehow we trundle along for, I think, is a very important period of recovery, which I think you tell me, in terms of anyone involved in emergency planning, is quite crucial in terms of the assessment and need and post-recovery issues. Something wasn't quite right. Colleagues, let's bring. I'm going to take Navin very quickly. You're going to have to amend your formal questions slightly because we've covered it. Then we're going to go to Tony Devonish because we've got lots of questions to ask still.
Barry, you commented that Kensington, Chelsea are a small-scale authority. However, for 3 days, before activation, they put in their own, mobilize their own resources. Are you or anyone on the panel able to tell us what was the actual structure of their operations and how did it actually work?
All I can say is when I arrived, and like John mentioned, he attended their Gold meeting on the Friday. I think what happened was the London Gold took over at the week, that time, and I then arrived the following week and saw how they were organised, and they were organised in a sense in the same way that London Gold sets up. There was a housing, a humanitarian, family assistance centre and so on. So they were mobilising in the lines that's established by the London Gold arrangements. The numbers of people who are mobilised, I will get back to you on because I don't have that, but they were organised not in a haphazard way, but in an organised way in accordance with the London Gold and the emergency arrangements.
I mean, it is worrying that it took them 3 days to realise that, given the constraints they've had, they to trigger enlist gold support and activate. Yeah.
The leader of my council and I have apologised to people for the response in the immediate aftermath of the fire. We've apologised directly to the victims, the survivors, the bereaved, and the community in that area.
Yeah. Assembly Member Tony Devenish.
Can I start with John and Eleanor? Could you, John, start by taking us through, please, the process by which Gold assesses the need and accesses levels of support, please? And perhaps you can do it in terms of the processes and policies that you have, but also perhaps, and I declare an interest, but I know some of the things that were being done by the boroughs. I think it would help if both you and Eleanor gave more examples to the members of how informally teams of officers across London were already feeded into the process. So I'm not sure that point's come out strongly. It's not as, with respect to Naveen, as what he said, it took 3 days and almost nothing was happening, to misquote him. A lot was going on, and I think perhaps you could illustrate that with some of the examples you've given me in the past.
If I can do the top level and then drive down to the specifics. So the group of emergency planning officers across London do meet and oversee the creation of the individual plans. You've heard of one, which is the humanitarian assistance plan. That covers all the areas you'd expect it to, through rest centres, through those aspects of housing and so forth. And that was the plan that was implemented by Kensington and Chelsea. And they went through that. They held meetings in the early days, I believe, for that. That process is developed across London, and there is a minimum standard, as it were, of capability that boroughs say that they will meet. Okay? And that process takes place for humanitarian assistance, mass fatalities, and the various other plans that I think were described to you at a previous session. In terms of the local arrangements, Kensington and Chelsea were offered support from other London boroughs and indeed accepted it on various of those strands in the first 2 or 3 days. Officers went with some experience, went across to assist the leadership team in Kensington and Chelsea, as Eleanor said, on the Wednesday, in fact, they started to arrive, to provide support. The activation on the Friday was the transfer, as it were, of the London Local Authority arrangements and the activation of the formal mutual aid took place on the Friday. Conversations, though, on the Thursday. So the plans exist. There is a rather large binder, Eleanor, I think, has somewhere about her person, about an inch thick of those plans that each London borough has activation processes for, which would cover things like humanitarian assistance, as I say.
Thank you. And Eleanor, in terms of specifics, particularly in terms of, I guess the question most members are asking directly and indirectly is effectively, what can Gold do until mutual aid is asked for in terms of that joint working?
I think what Gold can do until the resolution is actually invoked in a formal sense is exactly what did happen in relation to offering specifics of help and support, sending in officers, named officers on particular topics or for particular bits of the plan. Other parts of the plan activate anyway. For example, the mass fatalities plan under the ownership of the coroner. I think that the early part of your question, though, is about how we then build on what is there. Because if you think of it in relation to the evidence and the structures that you can go back to, you go back to the minutes of the Strategic Coordination Group that was at that point under the command and under the Gold command of the Metropolitan Police Service, with all the other agencies feeding into that, including what was happening in Gold, in Kensington and Chelsea. And the things that they had done, for example, the temporary accommodation that they had put the survivors into, we then, in terms of taking over, in the first instance, we're providing support in the way that we can on an informal basis when we've been invited to by the borough itself. But once the gold resolution is actually invoked, we're in a position to be able to examine each of those strands, whether it's all of the individual bits of the humanitarian assistance plan, the rest centre, the temporary accommodation, the communications, the direct community engagement, and the other elements of the plan, including issues around rehousing. So we can get into much more detail once and much more ownership once that resolution is invoked. But prior to that, all we can do is offer advice and assistance.
Thank you. And you've had several months since the tragedy now. A number of you are chief executive within London councils. Is there a role for London councils going forward, and what have you concluded? I know it's a work in progress, but is there any points you've come across in your London council's hats that you could share with the committee that are relevant?
So if I can give a bit more detail on the review that's taking place, which I think may speak to that, because there are lessons clearly to learn in terms of the response of the individual authorities within London and the arrangements, and whether the arrangements are actually fit for purpose given what happened at Grenfell. And that will be reporting back to the leaders of London councils in February, I think, next year, to give an indication of timeline. The two people involved to lead that are Tom Reardon, who's the Chief Executive of Leeds City Council, a very experienced Chief Executive in a different part of the country, and Mary Ney, who's currently one of the commissioners, I think, up in Doncaster, but Mary has a background, as you know, Chair, in local government in London, and understands the arrangements and can therefore help interpret those. Leaders are being met as part of that, along with chief executives, along with partner agencies, NHS as an example, along with community groups and so on as well. The terms of reference for that are to make sure that the plans that were developed last year and the year before for improving arrangements, which were horribly called EP 2020, we love acronyms in this business, which was looking forward to what would a fit for purpose set of tools and responsibilities be in the future. To validate those are still right, and that included support in exactly the areas we've been discussing this morning so far, and also looking back and seeing if the arrangements we've got are still fit for purpose. So those are the ones we're focusing on. That does include activity by members as well as officers, so it includes both ends of this, as it were, the action of London councils itself as well as the emergency planning side, and as I say, reports in February.
Thank you. And in terms of how Gold spends money or is able to spend money, how did that process work? How is money triggered? And could you confirm that money wasn't a problem in any way in how things worked out?
No, it wasn't an issue at all. There is two things apply. The resolution has particular spending limits that apply until such time as the requests are made. So there are some technicalities around that. The Bellamy scheme, which is central government support in the event of major emergencies, was also activated. And between London councils, there is an arrangement that £100,000 can be spent by each authority that they will take themselves and use within internal resource. That's their contribution, as it were, to mutual aid. Anything above that is claimed against what's called the Bellamy scheme. And that's in addition to any spending that was done directly by Kensington and Chelsea, which would be mainly on capital and service support and so forth. But money was not an issue that, in terms of responding, that arose at all.
Thank you, Chair. I'm looking for your guidance on the next question you've got written down. I think it's pretty much been answered, but what I would ask in terms of, I'll read it out. It says, in the disaster situation, how are levels of humanitarian need assessed? What is the process of providing that help to survivors, and which organisations are involved? I think it's been answered, but if you feel not, please. One I think would really help, though, at some stage, I mean, obviously post the meeting, John, some kind of org chart showing exactly how everything fits in, because this is very complex for even those that were involved in terms of who did what when.
More than happy to, Chair, to provide that. I think, can I make a comment about humanitarian assistance? There was a phrase used called key workers, and it was very clear, and it speaks to Mr. Bailey's point earlier on, that the needs of the individuals, the victims, the people displaced from their homes, was different to that expected in some senses. The response and the resource that we would have and was social worker response. Now, the nature of a social worker actually is different to that needed in this circumstance. And it appeared over time that one of the lessons learned was it's probably closer to the police family liaison officer role than it is a social worker role. And part of the learning, again, and we've asked this to be part of the review, is what does that person, what does that skill set look like? And there is a requirement to train people up in London to be able to fulfil that should we need this again. And that's another piece of learning out of this. Individuals clearly did have issues with the key workers that they were assigned, the ability of the key workers to respond and understand the needs of the individuals and the families, and then to get access to the right services. As those were raised, we did try to deal with those, but systemically there was an issue about finding the right skills in local authorities to provide that wraparound support.
I'm going to bring in Andrew Boff, Navin Shah, Sean Bailey.
On the morning of the fire, how were the SCG was set up, the protocols were activated, the SCG was set up. How were Kensington, Chelsea asked, requested? What happened? When were they? We've heard from Mr. Kelly about the Thursday that there was a meeting with KNC, and in that evening they took the decision to activate the protocol. But I'm more interested on Wednesday, when we did know it was a very large scale. We did know that the SCG responsibilities, one of the standard items on an SCG meeting is the recovery stage, so it must have been considered even at that early stage. At what point, how were KNC communicated with in order to, over this request that they consider help?
I honestly couldn't answer the question. I wasn't on the SCG, and it would be speculation, Mr. Roth, being brutally honest. I've got no knowledge of what was said on the call or being present.
Mr. Quirk, then, I don't know if you have any information as to when KNC were first asked by the SCG to.
I'm afraid I don't have that information. In fact, I wasn't aware of what Eleanor Kelly said earlier, which seemed to me to be a very useful contribution, really, in terms of.
One of the things we haven't got is minutes of the SCG or minutes of the decision-making process. It would be very helpful for this committee to have those, because it's quite difficult to understand why the collective protocols failed if we don't know how they were applied at the time.
I don't wish to appear unhelpful. I'd need to check whether I've got them, because if I don't, I can't obviously release them. They're chaired by the LFB and the Fire Brigade. I'd have to go and check.
They are there.
Yeah. And I'd expect the public inquiry also to have had those released as part of the public documentation. So,
Chair, I think that would be a matter for London Resilience as the Secretariat for the SCG. I believe they've already provided the committee with an attendee list for those meetings, which obviously gives you the times at which the committee met, and then any requests obviously you can direct to London Resilience, and obviously they'll provide information where they can, consistent with the requirements of the public inquiry.
I think we've actually requested them, and I think we had a positive on that, and I think they must have been checking with partner organisations or going back, but we will pursue that further. Navin Shah.
Yeah, should there be a place for Mayor's representative or GLA on the Gold Group, given the strategic nature of that group is, and indeed in terms of progressing joined up working,
So the Strategic Coordinating Group, which meets to coordinate the response to an incident, does have a GLA representative on it. The GLA duty officer sits on that group in order to be informed, because the Mayor's responsibility for the response phase is to act as the voice of Londoners, and so the duty officer plays a role there to hear what's going on, ensure that whether GLA is able to contribute support or make offers, we do that, but mainly to ensure that the Mayor is briefed on what is going on.
So David, you are content with that arrangement and how it has worked in case of these incidents, because we are talking about learning lessons and anything that would speed up decision making and effectiveness of the sort of emergency tasks that there are. And that's why I raised the question. Obviously, I don't want to add another layer of bureaucracy or, just making the sort of gold group wider. But if it does help, somebody on the ground actually observing, if not actually actively working within the gold group, can be helpful, and thus I raise the question.
I think we just need to be clear, Chair, on a couple of things. So firstly, here we're talking about response, we're not talking about recovery, which the government guidelines make very clear is to be local authority led, and the London procedures provide for that. In terms of response, they say the GLA duty officer attends the strategic coordinating group. In general, those are done as phone calls because clearly the partners are based within their own organisations. There is procedure for them to come physically together in a metropolitan police facility should circumstances make that appropriate. I'm not aware that that happened in the Grenfell incident. I think it was all done using telephone conference facilities. It's important to be clear that the strategic coordinating group is about bringing together the leadership of partners who are carrying out their own responsibilities. It's not about managing those, and it's not about on the ground. And so, for instance, if you think about the police, they will have they'll have gold, silver, bronze arrangements. The local authority will have similar, and it's so the GLA is in there watching. And being informed and offering help where we can at the strategic gold level, which clearly is some distance from actually being physically on the ground.
Okay, but can I just get some clarification on that? It is the responsibility of the SGCG for recovery. It has a remit for recovery.
Well, as we've said before, I mean, John probably will come in on the second house, but response and recovery inevitably overlap. Perhaps in some of the terrorist incidents we've been fortunate to see in the last year, there's very little overlap because the actual incident is over in a matter of minutes, and thus the response operation is over in a matter of hours, and one's very quickly into recovery. And, obviously Eleanor had personal experience of that with regard to the London Bridge attack. Clearly, for something like Grenfell, it's a lot more complicated. The response runs for a significant period of time. Recovery starts underneath that, so the process allows for recovery work to get underway and the strategic coordinating group to have visibility on that. I don't know, John, if you want to add more on the
if I could add to the complexity.
This is very complicated.
So the strategic coordinating group actually carried on beyond the Friday, and it was chaired by the Met Police at my request. And the reason was we had a lot to do in trying to pull the recovery piece together, as I talked earlier about the number of people involved and setting up structures to now start to deal with things. So the strategic coordinating group continued to the 22nd, if my memory is correct, at my request, led by the Met Police. And that was a piece around who's chairing and pulling together the agencies into that strategic group. At the same time, there was a recovery coordinating group looking at the individual work strands for local authorities and other agencies. That gives an idea, I think, Mr. Buffer, the complexity of this.
One of my concerns over this incident is this is not easy. And when you're hit with a disaster and an unexpected event, you would have expected everybody to know what they're doing and everybody to know who's in charge. And actually, I don't think that's the case. I think it's not your responsibility, but clearly it says on the resilience document, it says that the recovery management protocol is usually activated by the chair of the SCG at the request of the London Local Authority Gold, which suggests to me, as a lay person, that you don't need to talk to the particular borough, you just need to talk to the Gold.
No. Can I try and put that into the
and
process in different ways?
That's absolutely fine.
Stupid, but
So the strategic coordinating group looks after the response. It is chaired by the appropriate body in terms of response. Initially it was the fire brigade, but generally when there's a major incident that then moves across to the police. initially, I guess in this situation, a 5 a.m. phone call, there's some thought, we're going to need to think about recovery, but you're not really, doing anything active about that at that incredibly early stage. And then what is going to happen is that the Strategic Coordinating Group is going to agree to activate the recovery procedures, which then provide about local authority chairing of the recovery process. And then the chair of that process, which obviously was John from the Friday, is a member of Gold, a member of the Strategic Coordinating Group, and ensures then that there is discussion and alignment between the response effort and the recovery effort. And in this, obviously at some point the response work is done. Clearly in this situation, the Strategic Coordinating Group kept meeting on a less frequent basis for a week or so, because there were 1 or 2 response issues still around, for instance around the reopening of the Hammersmith and City line, bus services in the area, and just to ensure that the coordination was in place while John led the recovery effort.
The normal process for this, I think, as Steve would have said, is the chairing of the SCG does transfer when the balance of work moves from the Met and the response across to local authority. The difference here was, given the volume that we had to do, that frankly I had to do, I had to spend the time available on the setup of our recovery work, and the Met as on request continued to chair the SCG, although in reality the bulk of work had transferred across to recovery. It was pragmatic.
I've just been advised why we've not got those minutes, because the Resilience Group are checking with the Met whether we can have those minutes. And I think we need to clarify the bits of the minutes we're interested in are in terms of the local government recovery issue, not the question that the police recovery issue would be identifying bodies and part of their inquiries into the affair. So, and I'm very clear, at the time that you asked them to do that, that's when normally it would have been passed to local government. And, I have to ask this question, John. This wasn't for some sort of politic with a small p question. It was about workload responsibilities, because it is quite onerous.
It was a 500 staff chair. Yeah, I mean, we're talking here of every borough providing staff, and the entirety of managing government machine, which you'll understand, the Mayor's office, which you'll understand.
I'm now going to ask Andrew, but just to get clarity of the point, can you read out the protocol about the, because we've been obviously clawing over bits of paperwork, about the role of Gold versus, and if you can clarify the role of Gold versus a local authority request for mutual aid. Which trumps which?
I'd love to read that out and quickly access it, but I know it's going to be hidden in here. This is an immensely complex.
We would like you to consider, maybe you can answer it because you live and breathe this, right? So we think there is something in those documents that says local government Gold can assess the situation and thanks very much, can do and support. I use your words, can support a local borough where the need is assessed that it's appropriate. Now, but we also see alongside that the request for mutual aid. So we think there are 2 issues there, and maybe it's we've misread it, but we had it quoted to us earlier on. We'll try and find it and access it, so where we can quote it to you.
I think that may be around the local authority resolution passed by each of the local authorities that talks about 2 different types of event. One is a rising tide event. It came from the salt and the snow issues a few years ago, where there was insufficient ability for someone to say, I'm going to take your salt supply bluntly, and that gave the power to do it on what was called a rising tide event. Just if things build up over time. That isn't what we had here clearly, and it was. Rising tide has a different...
In a quick time
it was a very quick
tide.
We
might have had something appearing over 72 hours.
But the protocol, it is not designed for that, and I'm sure you'd appreciate there is a piece here as well about the sovereignty of individual boroughs and other boroughs coming in and taking responsibility and direction for their staff and resources. That clearly is a matter for the individual boroughs, which is why it was written in the way it was.
We think that's very important, but equally we think the support to survivors and victims is more important than sovereignty and boroughs. And if something is going wrong, then I think the expectation from the public would be that you intervene to put it right.
Which is
and
why,
then we
Chair,
have an argument about sovereignty afterwards.
It's not about sovereignty. It was specifically about the question that was asked about activation.
Right,
the resolution itself.
It's the resolution.
It is in the resolution itself, and it's exactly the reason we've asked for the review, because there was a concern about exactly the point you raised.
Ah, good.
So the review is supposed to cover.
I think we were putting it on the table.
No.
So do you recognise that there could be an interpretation? We were right to think there is an interpretation that could be placed on that versus the right.
I think there may be an expectation it's there. That's the point we need the clarification on, and clearly part of the lessons learned need to be that is an expectation now that is available.
We've talked about the review. Just tell us what the timelines of the review is, and where does that fit in with the public inquiry? Does the review come after the public inquiry or before, and you're going to take some steps before? We might come back onto that. You hold on to that, and you think about how that comes. Sean, you wanted to come in. You've been very
I think some of my question may be asked, please forgive my ignorance, because I'm a layperson in all of this. But we've had comments about people wanting to see organisation charts. There was comments made by Eleanor around, which to me seemed like some of the support was informal at quite a high level, but was informal. We've just dug through a document where we were completely confused. Is this review you're looking at what, to my mind, and again, please forgive me if I'm wrong, the needless complexity of this all? Because it would strike me in a crisis situation, which this disaster definitely was, this complexity would slow your response. And of course, if people can't find their direct responsibility, they will take no responsibility because they realise what's coming down the line. And I just wonder, are you looking at these issues? And how did we get, in fact, don't answer how we got to this point, how are we going to get away from this point? Because to my mind, this is needlessly complicated and will stop people doing stuff.
So if I made an observation, and I just made it in a whisper to John a few moments ago, every chief executive in the country now will trigger whatever support they need very, very quickly. That's what's going to happen now. Whatever's written in any protocols, the reality of the learning and the training and the issues that we've had to deal with, particularly around the complexity of Grenfell, is the realisation quicker, as part of where we are just now. And that's what we'll all do.
It's easier to step it down if you don't need it than it is to get it up if you're halfway through a problem.
I think the point is very, very well made.
Yeah, I agree.
It is overly complicated to the layperson who we're accountable to, and therefore it ought to be made simpler for us and for others to call us to account over it. The point around, I think, behind that as well, is this is not an easy thing to do. From personal experience, it is probably the most challenging thing I've done in public service. Yeah. And the complexity, sorry, I'm going to use the word again of this, means that I think you need to go through a degree of specialist training and experience to be halfway able to do this. Part of the work that we decided as chief execs to do a couple of years ago was to pull together an ability for 7 of the chief execs in London to undergo more training and specific training with other services, including blue lights, to be willing to step into this kind of role should events happen like this. So again, part of the learning here is we need to accelerate that process, and the 2 colleagues here happen to be, they've offered themselves to be part of the 7 to do that, so we can offer a better quality, more in-depth, better trained leadership from the local authority.
The one request I'd make is to make sure it goes further down the staff ladder, because one of the confusions on the night was lots of external agencies, churches, mosques, charities took leads because there was nobody to tell them that their behaviour was or wasn't appropriate or would or wouldn't be useful, and that would never be at your level. You're not going to be directing those people. People further down the food chain as well would. So it's a plea that the appropriate members of the council staff get the training as well, so they can deliver quickly on the ground.
Can I just ask, in response to it, so we've kind of got a commitment that your protocols are going to be reviewed, is that correct? And they're going to change. So the London local authority protocols are going to change. have you got an assurance, perhaps from Mr. Bellamy, can we also assume that there will be some changes in the strategic coordination protocol as well? I mean, just for example, when you bear in mind this has got to be used during a disaster, and it refers to the same body with two different names within the protocol, that adds to the kind of confusion that you really don't need. So can we get an assurance that this document as well will be reviewed in the light of the shortcomings that were demonstrated during the Grenfell disaster?
The one of the same have to go side by side.
So I think, to answer the question, ultimately these processes are, they are owned by London Resilience Forum. That forum, as I think Steve Ham said to you at your earlier meeting, is reviewing all lessons from arising from Grenfell and will apply all necessary changes as a result of that. So that process is underway. It obviously will need to take into account what comes out of the peer review that London councils have arranged around the mutual aid processes. So that will need to go in. It also, of course, will need to ensure that the documentation is consistent with what legislation requires to be in place and government guidance as well. And so, I'm clearly not an expert on these matters, but those are the factors that London Resilience and the Forum will want to consider in terms of, I think all of us, whether it's resilience or whether it's anything else, always want documentation to be as clear and straightforward as possible. But at the same time, you always have to balance that, ensuring that the information is there that is appropriate to deal with the range of circumstances that a city such as London can face. And that, I think, is what the Forum will need to consider as it looks at the lessons and looks at how things can be improved.
That may be correct, but as it stands, these documents are a hindrance to that. Nobody's saying that we don't want the documents to. It just seems to me that this document is beginning to prevent the staff from exercising their duties properly.
I'm not sure that that's the case. I don't think I've heard any evidence here that would lead me to that conclusion. I think the conclusion that I reach around Grenfell was that while there were offers of support were made from local authorities and others very, very early on, the mutual aid was not invoked formally until the Friday afternoon, and that should not have been like that. The mutual aid should have been invoked.
But we heard that people got involved immediately, and that members of staff went down there, a large member of staff, a group of staff went down and helped. So which is it?
And so the point of, as John said, the point of invoking mutual aid is to bring in somebody who can provide that coordinating role for all the help that is being provided, whether that's formal help that then local authority Gold brings in from the authorities around London, or whether that's help that's going in from local authority staff or others on a more spontaneous basis.
I think that's right. An indication of that would be the number of chiefs that were involved here. I dealt with the bombings in 7/7, and we used far fewer senior staff in the bombings in London than we did in this incident. To just pick up Mr. Buff to get to absolute clarity, the resolutions of London councils did work as intended. The issue was about the process for invoking them rather than those themselves. So, and I think that's a very important distinction here between the system, the legality, the system that it's based upon actually has worked 7 times so far this year and did work in Grenfell. The difference here is the circumstances were, as Barry has said before, unique. We've not had this scale before in London, and the need for the invocation of those arrangements and how they're done is what we've asked for the review to take place on. Should that result in actually there needs to be a change, then that would be considered. But I don't think we start from the premise that those legal agreements between councils are dysfunctional somehow.
Can I add to address Mr. Bailey's point too? As Doug said, that every sort of like chief executive, well, the first question that they'll be sort of like thinking of is, do I need help, and ask for it immediately? But also, as a point of reassurance, all of the London boroughs exercise their emergency planning arrangements all the time, and that involves all of the staff, the people who would be called in as silvers, the people who would be called in on the humanitarian assistance groups, the comms teams, everybody, and they're exercised all the time, sometimes on desktops, sometimes with other agencies in sort of like much bigger exercises. So we don't let the complexity of the legal arrangements or the complexity of the language get in the way of what needs to be done. And if you look at all of the other examples, although there's some incredibly unfortunate examples that there have been, as John said, 7 incidents this year alone, Grenfell stands out as the scale of the disaster that it was, but also the issue that gives specific learning points that need to be picked up. And in my experience, we learn from every single emergency, and every single time we either train or have to stand up our Borough Emergency Control Centre. So I just want to reassure you that it isn't everybody running around not knowing what they're doing. Each individual borough exercises their arrangements with all of their staff on a rolling programme all the way through the course of the year. I think it's another important point to be made, which is every incident you have to, and it goes to the complexity of the language, you have the local authority gold. So in respect of London Bridge and Borough Market terrorist attack, I was the local authority gold. And you have the London local authority gold. And at the time of the London Bridge and Borough Market attack, I believe it was the Chief Executive of Westminster. In my experience, every single time there's an incident, the London local authority gold, who's on call, immediately contacts the local authority gold, the borough gold, to say, do you need help? So the informal arrangements, but in a formal sense, that question is made very, very early on. In the vast majority of cases, you're in a position to say, not yet, but we'll come back if we need mutual aid. And that's and that question would have been put by London Local Authority Gold to Kensington and Chelsea on the morning of the Wednesday. So just to reassure you, it works in practice, and it's exercised to make sure that it works in practice.
Those calls logged, those requests to the local authority they are logged somewhere.
Yeah, by London Resilience. Yeah.
I would certainly like to see that.
Well, they will come out through the public inquiry.
Yes.
In terms of our, I think members would like to see lots of information,
Yes.
but if we can, we will. But in terms of what we need to do, I think we've got pretty most of the information, albeit we'd like to see the minutes of those local government recovery phase of those meetings. I'm now going to bring in Sian Berry, Assembly Member Sian Berry. Another set of questions.
Great, I've got a couple of just very slight follow-ups here as well. I mean, I'm not completely convinced by the argument that we should rely on lessons learned and don't worry, we'll evoke it properly next time at all, because I think that might be true for the current batch of chief executives, but memories are short, and I think we do need to look systematically at how the system works and whether there are alternatives in the event that the local authority in question is not capable of invoking them. I don't think we can say, oh, they will just do it straight away. It's just, I don't find that acceptable at all. The other question I think we've not really got to the bottom of is, we've heard, yes, there's £100,000 can be spent, there are lots of people were offering advice, but clearly something important was missing on the ground because of what I think David Bellamy said a bit ago, that essentially the Prime Minister had a deadline, and on Friday, if nothing had been done, the Prime Minister would have had to do something to kick off this process. Is that... there was something important missing on the ground, and everyone was feeling this. This is true, isn't it? I don't feel like we're glossing over that point at all. Who am I asking?
I think to be fair, I think we've had the answers we've asked. I think there clearly was a gap. Call it what you like, leadership or someone taking and holding the ring. Right, but that's for others to work out whether that was organisational or not. But in terms of what we said earlier, that crucial time, I think compounded the hurt and distress of victims and survivors, and that was quite clearly for people to see on the ground, but also people could see it through their TVs, that something was not right. I think we've got to the bottom about whether the issues of the procedures, I think we've identified one particular procedure about mutual aid and when. Very clear it was offered, but when was the understanding it was needed, and was, is that an issue about training, or is that an issue about leadership, or issues, or is it a question of size of a borough, which I don't want to get into amalgamation of boroughs or anything like that. It's another discussion, another place. But it does say about capacity and intellect to understand what you're facing to deal with. Do you want to come in and try and answer Sean Berry's question?
Yes, look, as I said earlier, both the leader of the council, Elizabeth Campbell, and myself in very many meetings have said that the organisation of K&C failed people in that area, failed them, let them down in our immediate response. And we, I've got deepest respect for the people in that area, that they were let down at that time. I think what we were talking about here is mutual aid and how it works, and how, in a sense, we're doing this across London. But this is mutual aid not between people of equal capability and equal capacity. So, for example, the reason why Michael Lockwood of Harrow leads on the tower is because the dangerous structure experts in London were in Harrow. It wasn't because we just alighted on Michael Lockwood. It was because that expertise, not every authority has experts on dangerous structures. And so what we have is networked capability across London that's different in different places. And there's undoubtedly the case that immediate response was a failure at the local level.
Which the voluntary mutual support wasn't able to fill, such that there was an obvious gap by the Friday.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're quite right, and that brings into the peer review that London councils have commissioned. And when I met on behalf of the mayor those conducting that review, I essentially put on behalf of the mayor your challenge to them, which is that clearly the procedure did not work because it was not invoked, and obviously we're all around this table very conscious about democratic sovereignty and the rights of individual elected authorities. However, whether it's a situation because an authority chooses not to invoke in a particular situation, or whether it's a different sort of incident that perhaps occurs over borough boundaries, the process is designed to handle that, but we all need, the mayor needs assurance, this committee needs assurance, Londoners need assurance that this is going to work, and this problem is not going to happen again. And that's the challenge that is before those conducting the peer review, is to try and identify what changes are needed in order to achieve that. And to be frank, the mayor will look at what recommendations they make and then the response of London councils to those recommendations, and want to come to a view about whether he considers that to be satisfactory, or whether he needs to speak to government about a further change being made.
Thank you. The other slight gap I think we have in the discussion so far is in terms of communication, not the things that you have in your binders and all the the different groups that you're talking to, but from the ground. So the example I think John gave a bit ago of saying there were people, some of them were sleeping on people's floors, and some of them were in churches, and some of them were in different youth centres and places like that. How did you know that they were there? And I think people in London, on the ground, need to know that in the event of something like that, who is London Local Authority Gold, the immediate response. I mean, we're just about getting to grips with it after about 3 hours of meetings. And there needs to be something out there, I think, so that people on the ground who are caring for people, who are wanting to be part of the humanitarian response, who have maybe survivors, can feed that upwards. And I found that completely lacking. I mean, people, certainly in the wider community, because the the relief centre was there, but nobody could get in. That you needed a wristband. You had to be an actual survivor or a council employee or a registered volunteer. There had been a system of registering some of the early volunteers. But nobody else could actually get in touch and say, I'm down the road, there's some things that need sorting out, can you? So I kind of went in and had to try and get that information to people. But even as an assembly member, it was very difficult for me to know who to contact. And I think it's the simplest possible thing to solve is to have an emergencies system where somebody adopts the email address that's a standard email address or a standard phone number that people can use in that situation to bring the information on the ground together. Has that been discussed in the review? I know that email addresses eventually were created after you took over, John. Is there anything you can say about that aspect of things?
Again, it's a set of lessons to be learned, because one of the things was individuals, particularly local councillors, assembly members, the mayor, local members of parliament, got casework. They talk to local people, they need somewhere to park that, give the information across. So you're right, we did create an ability to do that and had a number of caseworks coming straight through, and in fact, definitely from the mayor directly, I think, when he visited the rest centre. Casework was created that we picked up. So there are lessons, and that has been learned. Information down. Part of it, I think, was about getting the right management and the right oversight of the rest centre work. And that's one of the first things that we did, in fact, was to get one of our chief executives, Paul Nastarak from Ealing, to take responsibility for the rest centre, to bring that level of, if you like, local authority gumption to try and get that and to get the processes and procedures in place. And that was done again on the Saturday.
That's really good. I mean, I'm just thinking if something happened tomorrow, setting up that page and the communication system, it's actually you could do that right now. You don't have to wait for this review, because I think that's really what people need to know. Absolutely.
And also, I have to say there's another couple of areas here. One is around trust and foundations work. The first time we've done this, in my experience of having a specific group who are looking with the London Emergencies Trust, with the various other trusts and foundations, creating, as it were, a network of experts in how does money get distributed and what is the network for doing that, donations and so on, has been set up under the City Bridge Trust Director, David Farnsworth, who's now logged and got a protocol and a process for doing that. That was created from the Gold Group because it didn't exist before. So there are a number of, and communications is clearly one, where we're learning that in due course. It's another example.
No, thank you for that. Okay, should we get Sean on this question before Sean does a formal question?
Just very quick one. So this would lead my understanding to believe, there's two elements I want to talk about. Are you developing some kind of broadcast technique protocol? Because what people need is access to quick information. The casework situation, to me, seems further downstream. You know, in order to stop so many people turning up and quite frankly making the situation more chaotic, if there was some kind of broadcast situation other than watching the news, I think that may have really helped on the ground, because a lot of people turned up and added to the pressure for the police and the fire brigade. And there's another thing around all the groups, and some of the groups, registered groups such as the Red Cross, etc. Is there a protocol for their touchstone so they do add to the recovery rather than interfere with it, because they're acting on their own belief rather than the belief that you at London Council etc. want? Does that protocol exist, or is it being developed?
Two bits. I'll pick the last one first. The British Red Cross are part of that not the first strategic coordinating group. They joined a little bit later, but they have an invitation to attend, and they're the key link with the organised voluntary sector, if I can put it that way. And they were based with me over that weekend. The chief exec of British Red Cross was in the Westminster facility from that point on. And as you know, they had people in the rest centres pretty much all the way through. They've also recently announced a process of encouraging local pre-registered volunteers. One of the early lessons from Grenfell again was the number of people willing to put themselves forward to help overwhelmed whatever system was in existence. British Red Cross have now come up with a community volunteer scheme to allow people to pre-register to help if things like this were to happen again. And that's a very good, immediate, I think they had this in plan already, but they've escalated and brought that forward, response from Grenfell.
Okay, Sean, can we do your...
So we're moving to the slightly longer term now, aren't we, after the initial response has happened. Has London Local Authority Gold now started to hand back responsibility for things to Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, and how much and when has that happened?
So it started on the 8th, sorry, day later, on the 8th of September, and there was a work programme to get things in a state from both the handover and KNC's capacity to take over all of the work strands. I want to emphasise that a lot of this was already being done by Kensington and Chelsea. There's a bit of a misnomer that KNC had no one doing anything. Actually, a lot of staff involved in the care, the humanitarian assistance and the housing were KNC staff all the way through. What we did was to add to the capacity of KNC. The 8th of September was when most of the work strands handed across. The ones that have been kept separate from KNC are the coronial support, so the support for Dr. Fiona Wilcox as she does the coroner's inquiry piece, and that's Westminster leading that, as she's based over in Westminster. The site recovery, the site itself, as Barry said, has been kept separate for reasons that the committee will understand, and there is a process for that going forward. The third area is David Farnsworth's on Trust and Foundations, now predominantly led, I have to say, by the Charity Commission. That was done to give a degree of independent oversight, hopefully with some degree of confidence from the community of that independence, to the charitable management of the charitable funds. And the fourth area is the financial one of preparing the request to government for support for local authority expenditure, and that's being kept away at the moment as well. For no other reason, it's being dealt with by Westminster finance staff. So they're the four areas that are still not transferred across, if I put it that way. The rest went on the 8th of September.
When all went in one go, things like the rehousing support, responsibility for the key workers, which we'll get onto in a minute, the wider community mental health organisational support, that all rested with Kensington and Chelsea since the 8th of September. Because I'm looking at this task force report, that the Independent Grenfell Recovery Task Force, that is let me get this right, this is from the DCLG, from the central government. They've been there, they were called in, I think, on the 27th of July, so they weren't there from the start. They've been looking at the recovery phase only, and how well people have been looked after. This report is horrifying. I mean, the conclusions in it are just shocking, and including about the situation we're in now, which is where such a very small number of people have actually been permanently rehoused. There's a lot of recommendations to do with better preparedness and training in the future, but also the rehousing, the support for the wider community, the work on mental health support. All of these things start now, start in November, start in December. The report came out a few weeks ago. What can you tell us about this, to Barry Quirk? What lessons are you learning now about this while we're on like the third phase of recognising that things have gone wrong?
Yes, well, we are, I mean, first, I have to say I gave lots of the recommendations from the Independent Task Force report. We were actually in the process of implementing and in the process of accept entirely their recommendations about greater pace, greater innovation, the need for frontline staff in particular, but everyone really, to be much more empathic and caring and compassionate when dealing with people who have essentially been through unbelievably traumatic circumstances and that still now and will for very many months and possibly years be subject to trauma, both individual, family level and community. And we are looking at trauma-informed approaches to how we work with survivors and also the local community. So I entirely accept the report and entirely accept that we need to increase the pace. The issue has been that as I said earlier, that the council's social housing stock is very small. And so really from the time I've been there, I'm trying to identify how we can raise resources in order that we can buy property. So at the moment, the authorities committed 300 million, 235 million on capital, and 65 million on revenue, in order that we can deliver services. Now, the 235 million is actually to buy properties. We are at the moment purchasing properties at the level of 30 a week in the West 10, West 11 area in order to rehouse people. So I mentioned that at the time of the fire, at the time we've been discussing, 1 in 20 of all of Kensington Chelsea's tenants were in hotels. I mentioned that the turnover of the stock is so low that actually to try to find available social housing stock, there have only been, I think, 11 voids in the period since then. And so people want to be rehoused in their community. The communities in areas where two-bedroom properties are extremely expensive. Why we're spending 235 million buying about 300 properties. So we had 100 at the outset, 100 or so at the outset in Kensington. Well, it's probably best if I don't say exactly where they are, but we had 100 properties that were new that John himself was involved in. We did lots of discussions with Peabody Trust, and we're adding to those week by week. At the moment, just trying to check the numbers, at the moment we have, of the 208 households, that were, there were 156 households that came from the tower. This has grown by a third to 208 for completely understandable reasons, in that there was multiple households in one property, as there is throughout London. So there are 208 households. We currently have 36 have moved into permanent accommodation. Another 38 have accepted the offer of permanent accommodation, and we're in the process of meeting lawyers and so on, because many of them want to have exactly the same rights as what they had. And we've made an absolute promise that when they move into a property we offer them, they will have the same terms and conditions that they had in a Grenfell property. And where that's been a housing association property, we have to negotiate with the housing associations in order that we essentially buy that assurance. So we're making a capital payment to them in order that they can have that assurance. And one of the issues, of course, is right to buy. And we're dealing with that issue with some housing associations literally at the moment. So 36 have moved in, 38 have accepted an offer. We've got 47 who are living in temporary accommodation. So there are 110 in hotels still, 15 living in serviced apartments. So we've got 125 of the 208 that are currently in emergency accommodation still. This is a council, though, that has 2,000 households in temporary accommodation, one of the highest in London. And now of that number that I just mentioned, 125 that are in either in a hotel or in serviced apartments, 34 of them, these households, have children that are under 18. Now, as of yesterday, 16 of these households have accepted the offers that we've made. So we're literally looking at this household by household, case by case, and we're saying what's right for their people's permanent homes. And we're having to. There's lots of coverage and commentary about this. I think it's absolutely critical that we bear in mind individual families, the trauma that they've been through, and they're having to make decisions about where they're going to move. And in many cases, we've made a number of offers to households, and we're saying it's very much up to them as to what's the right, suitable quality of offer for them. So the big issue for us is about housing and having them properties available that are suitable and appropriate, and that the households then can choose to move into, and we then support them moving in. At the same time, there's the issue about key workers and
Can we pause that for
okay, stop there.
Pause that for a second. Just because we are interested in rehousing issues. I think but the key thing here is we're not asking for a progress report in lots of detail. We are trying to get to the bottom of what the problems were that meant that we're now getting a report on your rehousing progress that we might have expected in about September, not November. I mean, I appreciate that there are complexities, but why has it taken so long to realise? I mean, presumably you're out there buying homes now at market rates, effectively, and there are homes on the market all the time. Why wasn't that decision taken sooner? And has it taken the nudge from the government review task force to look at that?
No, we were purchasing that before. The issue really is about the availability of social housing stock and the extent to which people from Grenfell Tower and Grenfell Walk wanted to live. Look, there's many people that want to live in the immediate area.
Yeah.
There are others that don't want to live there when the tower's still there.
Mm-hmm.
Or they actually want to move from the area. Everyone has their own circumstance. Everyone else has their own intentions. We have to work at that.
No, I completely appreciate that. Actually, the ability of people to make final decisions about the rest of their lives, having suffered the trauma, is one of the hold-ups.
Yes.
From what you just said, it seems like you're only looking at effectively social housing type stock. You're not buying street properties.
Oh no, we're buying street properties.
Right. Okay.
We're buying street properties at market price, and we're then letting people as social properties.
But you couldn't have done that sooner.
No, I don't. I mean, well, in my view, we did this as quickly as we possibly could because we had to raise 235 million in order to do that and make arrangements for so doing, which we've done from the general fund, not from the housing. This is another issue about the structure of housing tenure in London and the particular and atypical structure of it in Kensington and Chelsea.
I mean, the task force has talked about the bureaucracy and the fact that this is people on the ground don't understand why there are these delays in the bureaucracy there. The other thing I wanted to ask about was support for the wider community, particularly the recognition that the wider community were suffering from trauma too. Early on in the process, I witnessed some very poor attitudes towards the wider community. This seems to now have changed to a recognition that this is a community in trauma that needs the ability to access mental health support, that needs community support, that needs to be given community facilities to build up their confidence again as a community. Can you describe what you're doing now about that, and also how long it took before the NHS was properly brought in to do this kind of thing?
I think I would say one of the first meetings I had when I was there was with the NHS Mental Health Trust, because I was used to working very closely with SLAM in South East London, and I worked with CNLL and had meetings with the Mental Health Trust there, with the senior, both the chief executive but also people that were working, organising front level support, as well as the public health people that were doing work with the CCG and local GPs locally. I think, and I'm really impressed with the work that's been done, really in terms of the volume of work, the range of it, the reach of it, and its accessibility. Certainly I think it may have taken a couple of weeks or so for people to recognise that there was a community dimension to this, not just a survivor and victim dimension. Because we were providing outreach facilities in hotels, the NHS, we had overnight arrangements on buses locally, so there were lots of cooperative arrangements between RBKC and mental health provision, both for children, families, survivors, but also the wider community. I do know the level of resource that has not in any way been constrained at all amongst the local NHS. I've been really pleased by that, and also pleased by the response of other government departments. I have to say DFE in supporting the schools locally. So we've been making sure there's not just the conventional settings, like go to the doctor, go to the hospital, it's actually going out to people, being present in places where they are, but also present in places where members of the family are. So literally ensuring that there's mental health provision in schools, in primaries and secondaries and so on.
Yeah.
And I think that it's really stepped up a pace considerably.
Just on that, finally, the need for it to be culturally appropriate, and I think in different languages is one of the issues that I've had brought to me. This is something that's being done now as well.
Yes.
Quite late.
Yes.
Okay. Can I turn to John Barradell now, because the next final question I have in this section here is about the key worker programme, and the task force report here talks about the various attempts to define the role of key worker and recruit appropriate people, and I think this is a really crucial thing, and it seems like you're in the process of, you were the person who set up the initial key workers, who were not quite the right people, and now so maybe you can tell us what went on there, why, I think basically 3 phases, one of the third phase of key workers now, and how we've got to where we are and what's going to happen next, and why it did fail, because I've had, again, casework-wise, lots of reports of problems.
I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of the lessons from this is understanding what the phrase key worker actually means to families and those affected, and also what resource we've actually got to ask people to be key workers. And the pool that we're using within local government tends to be either housing officers who have a particular set of skills, or social workers that again have a particular way of working, which may not be appropriate to the individuals that they're trying to deal with. So the initial response phase was to try and get someone to work with the families in the hotels to be a point of contact for them. What I believe started to happen, and Eleanor may comment this, because I know you're speaking to quite a few families around this, was that the responses they were getting, the requests that were being made, were simply not coming back. The information requested or the assistance being asked for wasn't being provided. Whether that was the systems weren't in place to do that, or whether that was the individual didn't know how to access them, was part of the learning that was done early on. And in fact, K&C, I think, produced a handbook for key workers fairly early on, saying this is where you go for these individual requests. There's a lesson in that, I think, as I mentioned earlier on, that we can do something about if we need it. Again, it's probably more on the police model of family liaison officers, which are very effective, but are specifically trained and appointed for that purpose. The second one, I think, on key workers, Barry may want to pick up.
I mean, I do believe this is one of the biggest areas for learning lessons, because of when you have an incident of this scale with this number of people who's gone through trauma and bereaved, it does the needs of families, individuals, changes and develops quite substantially. So there are a number of, and we adopted this, as you said, from early September, and we've changed the approach once, because it was very clear to us in talking to survivor groups that the approach was inconsistent and there was differences. There's 154 key workers, for example, at the moment, and of them, really a third are Kensington and Chelsea. I beg your pardon, 2/3 of Kensington and Chelsea, but 1/3 were pre-existing social workers at Kensington and Chelsea. Another third have been hired. So there remains a third of support from across London, because people wanted to keep this. So there are 5 key workers from Red Cross still that are supporting people, because the people they're supporting want to stay. They don't want to be passed to somebody else to be there. They're really confident in the individual that's giving them support. But a number of people want practical and financial assistance and help and advice about how to get housed, not just emotional, psychosocial support. And so that variety that's needed for key workers means that you can't just have one generic worker that deals with everything. For some households, they do need a properly trained social worker that understands issues of trauma and understands how to deal sensitively and appropriately with them, as opposed to how to access finance and how to access housing and so on. So I think this is one of the big areas for learning when you have large incidents like this. How do you develop key worker approaches, and how does it feed in with the police family liaison officers? Because they do work hand in hand in many ways, the flows and the key workers.
One of the things you've just not quite mentioned there is the role of them as an advocate.
Yes.
And given that you're saying 2/3 of them are still Kensington and Chelsea staff, and who presumably were before the tragedy.
No, because we've hired a third.
Okay, but some of them, I mean, the point is, they're not the people that those people who've had this trauma are most likely to trust. And they're also potentially not the people who have the skills of standing up to the council and arguing against things like the silos that appear in this. There's an advocacy role there that potentially I think is what, John, you're getting at with the police family liaison officer.
I don't think, this where Barry and I may disagree unusually, that I think there is some lessons around advocacy in this particular incident that we have not again seen before, where there's been a clear wish for people to get support in making their case to the authorities, whoever the authorities be, and that is something that I've not experienced before in incidents like this, and it's not one that a traditional model of wraparound support would necessarily provide. And that's
if I might say, this tragedy, the survivors and those who are affected by this, we are not responding simply to their needs. We're having to respond as an authority out of duty and obligation because they were tenants of the authority. This is a really important difference. It's not just a needs-based response, it's one based on responsibility, because essentially they were the tenants of the authority.
I think there's an important point from early on in relation to the key workers, which is, and it is very much a learning point, is don't just hear what you've been told, listen to what's being said and understand why it's being said. So there were lots of examples of people saying that there was a problem with their key worker, and I think that what was heard was, I don't like my key worker, I want a different one. And therefore giving people a different key worker didn't address the underlying issue, which was that the key worker was not providing the support that was required. I think very early on there was an issue that was because that support in some examples was being given in the social care model, which is about don't make people dependent, get people to do for themselves what they are capable of doing for themselves, but didn't actually take account of the fact that in those particular circumstances and given that trauma, they were not in a position to be able to do for themselves. So there was no point signposting people to you go there or you go here or you fill in this form or you do whatever. And I think that that's sort of like one of the very human learning points in relation to the support that people need in their own personal circumstances. Everybody experienced the same disaster, but everyone experienced it in a different way. And for me, and the thing that I sort of like say within our organisation about how we will respond in the future is that really genuinely don't just hear what you've been told, understand why you've been told it and address the underlying reason and the real problem.
Okay, at this point, I want to...
Am I going on too long?
Sorry, you still...
I have one final thing I want to
fine,
just very quick. This is clearly a very specialist sort of job description that's emerging. I think you've all kind of agreed on that. I mean, can any local authority be expected to keep these people on staff? Isn't this a role for some external body to employ?
I think you can. I think there is an ability to train. I'm now going to prejudge what we say, which is a very dangerous thing to do. I don't believe I don't know any organisation that currently provides this, apart from aspects of it being the Met Police and the FLOs. FLOs are police officers that are trained for this, so they're not unique. They do other things when they're not being FLOs. Okay? And I think there is a model that we could undertake that does provide training and experience for people alongside their day jobs actually to be able to do this. And the key bit for me is understanding the needs of the individual, not trying to apply a single size fits every person in this. Urgent, immediate support may be of that nature, but you need to do an exercise of identifying what the needs, as Eleanor says, listening to what the needs of the individuals are. That requires a different response, and that requires
the other model would have been the old type of social workers that used to do welfare rights and do other advocacy issues, not just dealing with the issues of risk. Okay, at this point I want to read into the records and transcript, not to as a shorthand of digging out the Royal Borough, Kensington and Chelsea, but I think it's important about learning lessons here, and I think that any local authority that says this couldn't happen to us or whatever is being complacent. And I want it taken in that vein. And why? Because I'm going to quote in terms of the Grenfell Recovery Task Force, and I want it in our records so we understand that when we come back to this issue of why. So it talks about RBKC failed its community on the night of 14th of June and in the weeks following. Prior to that, we have heard that RBKC was distanced from its residents, highly traditional in its operational behaviours, limited in its understanding of collaboration working, and insular despite cross-borough agreements and with a deficit in the understanding of modern public service delivery. And that's why I say I think we all just need to be reminded that any practitioner in local government about how things can happen or be perceived or in reality occur. And just further notes, residents speak powerfully about the disjointed nature of the response overall. It seems that this lack of coherent collaboration working across agencies is a long-standing weak point which the council's allowed to fester unchallenged. I think that applies to possibly a number of local authorities up and down the country, never mind K&C. So I want to read that in so it's in the transcript. It's for others to determine that, but just to get to the reality of what the victims, I think, and survivors thought of the situations they were faced. Right, we're now moving on to a set of questions to the Mayor's Office. You can catch your breath. We are in the last phase, you'll be pleased to know, of our questions. Assembly Member Sean Bailey.
I have to address this to David, really, just to start off with. Can you set out the roles and responsibility of the Mayor's Gold Cell and the Mayor's Assembly Group? Can you set out the role as you see it?
Certainly. So what we do, so the responsibilities of the Mayor, obviously, if we look at the phases related to preparedness, response, recovery. Preparedness is carried out through the London Resilience Forum, which obviously the Mayor appoints the chair of, and we've touched on that. Response is really where your stuff comes into, so I'll come back to that in a second. And then recovery, which we say is a matter for local authorities. There can be some involvement, for instance, TfL could have some involvement in that, for instance, if buses are needed or other transport implications to the recovery. But in general, that's a matter for local authorities. So really focusing on response then. And what the strategic coordination protocol does is it sets out what the Mayor's role is. The Mayor's role is to act as the voice of London and to provide information and reassurance to Londoners about what's going on in relation to the incident that's taken place and that is being responded to by all the various agencies. The Mayor does not have an operational responsibility in any way for that, though of course some of the agencies the Mayor has oversight and responsibility for, the police, the fire brigade, Transport for London, clearly do. So therefore the role of the Mayor is to find out what is going on, be able to communicate that appropriately to Londoners. Of course at times there'll be some matters which can't be discussed publicly, and in the appropriate private forums where advice and steer is needed to offer that, but again recognising that the operational responsibility sits where it sits and the Mayor does not have locus over that. So having established that, then the question is what internal arrangements do we put in place in order to ensure the mayor can carry out that responsibility. So there are two things. Firstly, the Mayor's Advisory Group. So that's a concept that has been in place at the GLA for a number of years. It was under the previous mayor. What that very much is about doing is about bringing the commissioners and other relevant leaders around the table to brief the mayor on their plans, and the mayor can ask questions and can satisfy himself that appropriate coordination is in place. So we used that in May, following the attack in Manchester, when the country international terrorist threat level moved to critical. The mayor called an advisory group in order that all the agencies involved could brief him on the implications of the move to critical and what they were doing, and so the mayor could be reassured that the necessary steps were being taken. So that took place. We don't tend to use mayor's advisory groups for fast-moving, short response things, so terrorist attacks, where the response process runs for hours. A mayor's advisory group just isn't appropriate, and of course the mayor will speak directly to commissioners and others as appropriate, and will attend Cobra. And that then ties into Grenfell, where it wasn't appropriate to call the Mayor's Advisory Group because that would just duplicate the ministerial meetings that the Mayor was attending in any case. And so all that would have done would have taken people away from the response and recovery operations. And so instead, with the Mayor and myself playing a full part in those meetings, it wasn't necessary to establish...
Sorry, David, just to ask a quick question. When did the ministerial group start?
They started the first one was on the Wednesday afternoon,
okay,
day of the fire. And so, there was essentially one a day for the first few days. And so, in the case of Grenfell, it wasn't appropriate to form a Mayor's Advisory Group meeting, but absolutely that's something that we do, as we did following the Manchester attack, where it's appropriate to do. The other aspect of your question was about GoldCell. GoldCell is an internal group at the GLA which convenes in the event of such an incident in order to ensure that the operations of the Mayor's office and the GLA more generally are coordinated in order that the Mayor can carry out his role as the voice of London. So it consists of senior members of the Mayor's office, the GLA duty officer, who is the link point, as discussed previously, to the strategic coordination group, and the head of paid service, and also the head of the press office for obvious reasons. And so, the purpose and remit of that group, as I say, is to support the Mayor and ensure that all is in place for him to carry out his role. It's not part of the formal structures of stuff, but it's something that we have instituted because we found that that's the way of working that was just necessary in the Mayor's office in order that we could respond appropriately to events as they've unfolded.
Just a short question I want to drop in. In view of the conversation we've had around the complexity of this thing in its entirety, do you believe the name of the Mayor's Gold Group should be changed to avoid confusion?
So, what's in the name? It's an internal group. So, for our own internal purposes, the name is not important. It could be called anything. The reason the name GoldCell was adopted was so that when the duty officer speaks to people in the emergency services and the other organisations that they're speaking with, depending on the nature of the incident, they're able to say, I need this piece of information for the Mayor's GoldCell. And by talking about gold, that's a language that people understand, and that helps the duty officer get the response they need. And that's the theory behind it. It's absolutely not because the mayor has no operational responsibility. We're always very clear on that. It's absolutely.
I don't say it as a challenge to the mayors. But that's not the point I'm getting at. I am desperate to make these things less complicated because I believe complexity stifles action. I don't say it's a challenge. I just say it's something to be considered for you as a group. I suppose the next thing I'd really want to talk about is what do you see as the mayor's role in the immediate hours after the fire? At the initial disaster, this obviously we're talking about Grenfell. What was the mayor's role then? What do you see it as then?
So I think the mayor's role clearly is the voice of Londoners, and so he needs to speak to and for Londoners and to explain what is happening and what action is being taken. Clearly, he also has a responsibility in this incident in terms of, whilst LFIPA still exists, nevertheless the mayor has clearly some responsibility for the fire brigade, and of course the legislative changes that we're going through which will clarify matters there, which is helpful. But clearly, the mayor has a responsibility there. He also has a responsibility for oversight of the Metropolitan Police, and clearly, in both those cases, he'll be being briefed, as he was through the night, by the Fire Commissioner on what was going on the scene, and that's one of the reasons why on the Wednesday morning he visited Grenfell to work briefed directly by the operational leaders on the ground.
I think what I'm pushing for really, the director I want to look at, given the level of information the mayor has, and I think we'd all agree that the mayor has a role around communication, the voice of Londoners. After the fire was initially put out, there's a large influx of volunteers. Do you think the mayor could have played a stronger role in controlling that, coordinating that? Is there something? It strikes me that there was a communication piece there that the mayor absolutely could have spoken to. Is that a lesson we need to learn?
So the mayor absolutely has a role in terms of communication, in terms of amplifying the messages from those who've got operational command. So we've sadly had experience of this in a number of terrorist incidents, and what you'll see is the mayor using the channels at his disposal to amplify the messages of the Metropolitan Police and ensure that they, as the lead agency in that situation, and ensure that they get across. I think where you're identifying issues around communication, the mayor absolutely can amplify messages where those messages exist. And I know that there was some work done about trying to create a single location on the web which would be a single version of the facts for people to look at and to point people to assistance. And as that was established, then the mayor was able to communicate about that and help make people aware. But clearly it's for those in charge of the recovery operation to establish that stuff and define the message.
I see you're right, David, and I don't dispute that. What I'm suggesting, this isn't an attack on the mayor. This is about lessons to be learned. And in the aftermath of Grenfell, the mayor is most certainly one of the places people turn. And a lot of Londoners arrived in Kensington, Chelsea, North Kent, and it wasn't always helpful. They weren't direct. And I'm just saying, as a lesson to be learned, could the mayor consider he could have been part of directing that effort, helping London to understand what that community needed, so we all didn't make our mind up from all over London. That's the point I'm trying to get at. Can you consider in the lessons that you'll need to learn after this? I don't mean you personally, I mean your office. What and how you communicate. The point has been made early very strongly that this is unique, and it's unique in one sense because of the scale, but we will have faced some challenge, and the mayor does need to look at how he can speak into a problem to mitigate some of the ongoing stuff.
The issue with what you talk about there is if the mayor were to say, oh look, right, I can hear from the sources of information coming into me in my office that, look, there's no point volunteers going down there, it's swamped, etc. Right, and the mayor goes out and say, volunteers don't go there, then the mayor has actually just taken charge of an aspect of the recovery operation. Now, that may be exactly the right message. It may be an unhelpful message. It may be that the message is more subtle, that says actually what we do need volunteers, but we need volunteers with a particular skill set or whatever it may be. And that's why the role of the Mayor is around amplifying the messages that are agreed with the strategic coordinating group, working on the response and achievement of their objectives, and then the role of the Mayor is to amplify that. If things are going wrong, if the message is absent, then those with responsibility for the response need to get the message together.
Again, David, we're not asking the Mayor to make his mind up and deliver his message. We're asking the Mayor, to use your term, to amplify the message being given by the people who have strategic control. In this instance, it would have been very helpful to my mind. But just to move on, what assistance did the GLA provide towards a recovery period after the response, after initial response? What else did we provide? Did the Mayor provide in the recovery phase? Is there something there we could do more of or less of?
So, when clearly there were offers of help made immediately when we were in response phase. When John took over as local authority gold for the incident, we spoke, and I said to John that if there's any ways in which he thought the authority could help, then obviously we were at his disposal and we would try and do so. So I think we provided help in areas including help from the housing team here to help with the effort there. We provided a press officer to help establish a communications team there. We helped provide support in terms of community engagement, including a member of staff on secondment from the Assembly side of the authority, for which we're grateful. And also we enabled Team London volunteers to provide some help for a period of time when it became apparent to John that would be useful. So that's a kind of a summary of the support we were able to provide. Very much, it's a case for John of John, what do you need, and then are we able to do it? Of course, a very important thing to understand about recovery and why the rules are set up the way we are is that so much of the skill set that is needed in these situations are skills that the GLA, as a largely strategic authority full of policy officers and project delivery officers, we don't have the same sort of capabilities as a typical local authority would.
Correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is the recovery coordination group leads on humanitarian response. That's how I understand it. Okay, I'm right about that. Was the Mayor involved in this in any way? Did the GLA offer any support?
So as I said, through John, I said, John, you tell me what you need and we will see if we can provide it.
To what degree do you feel like the GLA got involved? Do you actually do anything that you feel added value?
Well, John,
I can probably answer that. Yes, they did. And I think they are members of, or the Mayor's offices are members of the recovery group anyway, as well as being that strategic group. They're also part of that. And every request was answered affirmatively. And that did include the London ambassadors, which were quite key in getting visible people out in near to the rest centre to be seen by the public, which was one of the comments that had come back, of getting people visibly from public authorities being seen. And that was part of the role played.
Okay, Is that how Team London were deployed?
Sorry, yes,
Team London,
yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I didn't understand because again,
Sorry, yes.
my personal thing on this,
Ambassadors
it's spread out in a very strange way. The who's linked to who's in charge of, and when what kicks in is important. Is opaque, and I think will be important going forward.
Sure.
And I think
maybe to help, I say to you what, to be frank, I said to the Prime Minister on the Friday at that meeting, which was that, somebody has to be in charge here. John has been appointed, he's in charge. The job of all of us, whether it's government departments, GLA, local authorities, is to provide John with the help he needs. And so it was in that sense, it's very clear and very straightforward. When John asked for help, for instance, from the Ministry of Defence on certain matters, it was forthcoming. When John asked for help from the GLA, as we discussed, we tried to help. Clearly, as John's already set out, he accessed huge levels of staff and support from the local authority community in London, and that's the philosophy. It was very clear that John, as London Local Authority Gold, took responsibility for leading that recovery operation, and all concerned were providing him with help wherever that was possible to do so.
That sounds great, and you know, again, I'm not trying to criticise, I'm trying to understand, because we could sit here and decide that it all went well and appropriately well, and it didn't. If you're a local person, it absolutely didn't. It went spectacularly wrong. So I say nothing as an attack. I'm just trying to understand what can be done.
I will say something, because I think that went very well from Friday onwards, albeit there were still problems, but by and large, that's the crucial bit. I think the question for lessons learned is how do we get that accelerated from the very earlier stages, that we're all under a level of understanding of what needs to happen at the right level, who's doing what, because I think that's the crux of the matter. That's the crux of the matter.
You're right, Chair, you're right, Chair. And I just want to understand, because the Mayor made comments about him feeling that it was going very wrong on the ground. And I just wonder, was there anything that he can do under his current powers, could have did differently to speed that process up, to give GLA resources over more quickly, or to ask people to take action with their own resources more quickly? Or is there something that we need to have changed in the review that's being done, or in our own practices, to make sure we don't, quite frankly, fail Londoners in this way again?
So, yeah, offers of help were made from here, from the get-go, in the same way as made from other local authorities. Clearly, by the minister, I came out of the ministerial meeting on the Thursday afternoon, and it was abundantly clear then that things absolutely, accepting that things were always going to be difficult on the first day after the incident for obvious reasons, but it was abundantly clear from that meeting that the response and the beginnings of the recovery operation were not what they needed to be. That's why I immediately, when I came back to City Hall, I rang John and said, "What's going on?" Basically, what are you going to do about it? And that clearly, discussions were already underway, as been earlier outlined, which led to the invocation of mutual aid. I think there are for me there are three lessons at high level to be learned from Grenfell. The first is that the mutual aid processes were not invoked early enough. They should have been invoked immediately. And clearly we've got, as discussed, the peer review going underway to try and work a way through to stop that issue ever happening again. I think there's a second issue which the Chair rightly referred to, which is that with the best response in the world, pre-existing conditions in the community and the relationship between the community and its council can create a challenge that the kind of theory of a response and recovery operation may not anticipate. And so clearly there's some more things there. We can have a perfect response recovery operation ready to go, but it deals with real human people and real situations, and we've got to deal with that. And then I think the third high-level area of learning is about the resources that are available to London Local Authority Gold to deploy, and whether we have the right capabilities available to us. It's clear that we talked about one example in terms of liaison with affected families, where there's a lesson to be learned that wasn't quite right. And I'm sure that as part of the wider Resilience Forum lessons learned from Grenfell, they'll be going through debriefing John and all the colleagues who worked for him. And John, you might want to say more about this and identify what those particular areas are, so that we can try and ensure that for future incidents, somebody in John's shoes is able to call on the skills that are needed and that they're actually available to deploy.
Okay, I've just got one question to ask John and yourself. You see this cabinet meeting and it arranged and happened. Is that the norm? Did that happen on the terrorist attacks we suffered, for instance? Was that government meeting that David?
So I can. So the government meeting is completely independent of what this process that John's. The process by which mutual aid was eventually requested, and John stood up as London Local Authority
Gold. What I'm asking, David, is that meeting always called in an incident of this nature?
The government meeting?
Yes.
So, no, this was a ministerial meeting, so that the fact that that happened was at the discretion of the Prime Minister.
Okay.
Yeah, as I said earlier, it wasn't a formal COBRA meeting, though it did make use of COBRA facilities. And yeah, it's a matter, yeah, the invocation of those procedures is a matter for the government, but whether that meeting has happened or not, that didn't impact on the decision to invoke mutual aid, because that happened clearly before then, and the meeting on the Friday, at which the Prime Minister took the chair, and then John attended over the telephone, you'd already assumed that responsibility that afternoon.
Okay. I just want to understand the complete structure. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Sean, and then we'll sum up.
Jen, about the sort of full casework side of things and the Mayor's office's role in that. You've described the Mayor as the voice of Londoners, but actually what you've described is mainly him being the voice to Londoners. And actually, I think, you know, in the absence of people being widely aware of the fact that there is local authority gold around the place, they will turn to the Mayor with their questions, their practical issues, their information that there are 10 people somewhere needing help. That must have come into the Mayor's office. And are there any internal learnings that you have about how you deal with a sudden influx of communication about an incident and pass that on to the right person? Because I had casework, I passed it on to the Mayor's office. It made its way through eventually. I wasn't sure if that was the right thing to do, but I guessed it might be, and I think other people would as well.
I mean, firstly, internally to the authority and speaking to Assembly members, in a situation like this, clearly, yeah, the Mayor's office is happy to help, and you're quite right that the Mayor's office is going to, as the Mayor goes out to visit the scene, is picking up casework, and he did pick up casework, and that necessitates us opening up channels so that casework can be passed on and addressed by the relevant people. So, in the sense of Assembly members, we're obviously more than happy to receive that casework and pass it through, or if there's a message from the recovery operation about where particular casework should go to, then obviously we would share that so that it could go directly and avoid the risk of any delay. What that obviously does is require that the recovery operation has been able to stand up and create the structures by which casework can be dealt with. And it's important, I think, to note that there would be casework from those who lived in the tower. There would be casework from those who lived in the upper walks and have been evacuated. There would be casework from others in the wider area. And it's about, John being able to create the operation to handle those and, reflect the responsibilities that you had.
Can I also say, I mean, we've used the word casework, but I'm also interested in the fact that, casework, communications from individuals across the area build up into a picture of strategic need. So you would get the Mayor would be in a good position to get the impression of what things were like on the ground in a way that people who are not on the ground, who are doing phone calls and who would know. And that's another thing. Obviously, we can all watch the television, but I think the Mayor might have been in a position to communicate that things were very bad on the ground. I know that he advocated, for example, for things like immigration amnesties, and that must have been as a result of being asked. But there must have been more sort of practical things on the ground that the Mayor
Absolutely. So, the Mayor went there on the Wednesday. He went on the Wednesday. He went on Thursday, spent quite a deal of time there, with the consequence that I attended the ministerial meeting on his behalf on the Thursday because he was up at Grenfell and couldn't be back in time. The priority for him was to spend time with people there and learn about the situation on the ground. And clearly that influenced things that he would say publicly. It influenced his interventions in the ministerial meetings in terms of being clear about where things needed to be pushed, and John, through some of those meetings you would have responded to his questions directly. And then yes, there would be matters that were more individual, which would be casework, which would have been pushed through and handled in the appropriate way.
So in terms of, the question is, did you do it all right? Was it all perfect? Would you do it differently if you had to do it again in future? Have you learned anything, was my original question.
I think it comes back to the high-level lessons learned I set out a few minutes ago. I think, the time that was effectively lost by the local recovery operation not standing up in the way it did created very real problems. And I think that meant that as we're starting to get through casework and things, because people are coming to the mayor perhaps because they haven't had success on the ground, you find that the operation on the ground is behind where you want it to be. So there isn't an operation to feed that stuff into. Yeah. And I think, John and I were in close contact, through all the days after that, and trying to ensure that we were passing things through and we were providing the help that we could, and whilst being mindful of the fact that John and team had a huge operation to create the infrastructure that was needed from clearly a standing start quite a period after the fire took place.
So the blockage was out, the mayor's, there was no problem with information passing through the mayor's office, no capacity issues. The blockage was after it went out.
No, I mean, the mayor had people with him when he went up there. Those people, including, we're fortunate, the members of the mayor's private office have experience as caseworkers themselves, and so they were able to take down details, and it's just a case of being able to route it through, as I think we said about the workers who are supporting the affected families directly, being able to route it through to somebody who could actually address the concerns. That was the real challenge.
And emails coming into Mayor at London, a lot of those would have been Grenfell related at that point.
I'm sure there was some, and clearly there are a huge range of emails that come into Mayor at every day, and there's a dedicated team, as you know, in this building who deal with that channel, and where things need to, they escalate up. And as it happens, the GLA duty officer at the time was assistant director with responsibility for that team, and so that helped provide good oversight that function was working as it needed to.
Assembly Member Peter Whittle.
Yes, yeah. It seems that just broadly speaking, that the mayor's influence is sort of as an amplifier, as you put it, and a facilitator in a way, for better or worse. And I was just wondering that, maybe John, if I could ask you, that is there a structural way in which the mayor's role could change to the benefit? I mean, in the sense that if you're thinking of the sort of, for example, Giuliani in New York after 9/11 or whatever, very much directed in some ways the effort. And I know that obviously the mayor has particular powers, and they are either great or small depending on how you look at them. But is there a kind of structural way in which she could, i.e. not just be brought in, as it were, but actually direct things? I mean, I don't mean to make you redundant exactly, but I mean, to be much more clearly defined as mayor.
I'd only go so far as to comment that I think clarity of role would be helpful.
Right.
However, personally speaking, the view I would always take is the mayor has a significant democratic mandate, and therefore if the mayor said this is what should be happening, this is what I'm hearing, that would be very significant in my what do I take into account.
Oh, fair enough, thank you.
If that sort of tries to give an answer without getting too much into it.
Okay.
Assembly Member Tony Devonish.
Could I ask David and John, it's probably a very difficult question to answer, but is the problem really that the public and the media confuse how government really works in London? Because there are the three levels, and dare I almost say that the boroughs actually in many ways are the ones that need to take the lead, but everybody wants to, whether it's the government of any political party, as mayor or national government, they want to take the lead, and that fundamentally is the problem.
I think what I would say is that the people of London shouldn't need to understand the detailed structures of government. Exactly. Yeah, that's for us collectively internally to address. Yeah, and I think what this incident showed was that there was an issue where it didn't work. That's why the peer review has been instituted, and that would look to address that. Clearly, when mutual aid was invoked and John took charge, then regardless of what the formal responsibilities were, we were working closely, and both, as John said, where the mayor had opinions and things, those were passed on, and where John could request help or assistance from the mayor or from the authority, John would do so.
Can I make a point in not answering the question, Mr. Devenish, in my usual way? I'm not a czar. The role is not a czar. The role is a coordinating role of getting others to do and to talk to each other and get things done as per a plan, and encouraging them to be flexible, fleet of foot, and adaptable to the circumstance. So it's not a dictatorial Giuliani point, back to Mr. Whittle's position. Right? And nor is the Mayor's in that sense. And part of the reason it works is because of that. It is about influence, it's about hearing, it's listening. The other thing we did that was very different on Grenfell to before was I had what was euphemistically called my shadow. The amount of work, and I called it scale before and was rightly picked up on it by Mr. Boff. The complexity of this meant someone had to go and do the media, someone had to go and do the public facing, and most importantly, go and talk to the residents and the survivors. Now, I could have done that, it's not my expertise particularly, but I'm more of a spanner, and I had to go and do the spannering, as I'd call it. Eleanor volunteered to go and do that really important piece as a joint goal, make the phrases, but to make sure that connectivity happened. So we did get direct impact of the survivors, of people on the ground, straight into Westminster where it was being run from the activity of Eleanor and others. So it was joined up in that sense, and we did get direct feedback, albeit somewhat anecdotally sometimes, because it was how many people were being met.
But I would add to that, because you made the point, Ms Berry, about would the information coming into the Mayor inform what was really sort of like happening on the ground that John wouldn't have been party to if what he was doing was sort of like sitting in an eyrie, sort of like taking phone calls. I think one of the issues in relation to the delay from the Wednesday to when we took over was that, to my knowledge, the first meetings where people in authority from all of the agencies stood in front of the victims and the bereaved and the survivors was the Monday evening, and that was a meeting that had actually been arranged by the community. And the first time that anyone stood up in front of the Residents' Association, therefore all of the residents of the Lancaster West estate, was on the Tuesday evening. And again, that had been arranged by the Residents' Association themselves. And that is absolutely one of the learning points in relation to the impact of the delay, because it meant that in terms of communication, even those people who were really directly and traumatically affected did not have anyone in authority speaking to them for 5-6 days. And so I think that's a really, really important point that has actually sort of been taken on board, and it's something that we can sort of like recognise in relation to that role, that if you're taking the role as London Gold, if it's too big to be able to do that direct community engagement piece as well as the operational piece, then you've really got to have a machinery that works very clearly on that, and that's not to underestimate it cannot be underestimated the impact that there was on that community. And I believe that, I don't personally think that the task force has got everything correct in their report, but I do think that the point that you put into your minutes is absolutely correct, because that's what we were working with on the ground.
And at that point, I'm just going to sum up. I've got one or two other questions really, just to tidy up the issues of where we are. Look, I just, in terms of the review, I get the picture, and I probably started out on this exercise looking at that period and what was the triggers and the protocols, and I think whatever the protocols are, we've got different probably views around here, the intended consequences, it didn't quite work out right. But I'm quite clear, the review is not just going to focus on that, it's going to look at the complete totality of what we're dealing with. So the issue of, and I don't know how you put this into emergency procedures, particularly in the day of modern media communication, but the issue of perception and reality operating at a number of levels. I'm quite clear a number of good people were trying to do a good job, but it wasn't good enough. And I just, and I think you can point to that, and there were barriers there about where that is. And I don't need a public inquiry to tell me that. Equally, there could have been some earlier interventions. that may have given different outcomes. We might still not have got it right because we were, as I think, alluding to about key workers and understanding some of those issues, our protocols wouldn't. I think one thing that will come out of this is that our knowledge and understanding about how we support victims and survivors is very crucial. We haven't got it right. We didn't get it right on 7/7. And there are lessons for the police services still about how do you deal with victims post an incident and what happens to them and where they go. So I think this will finally, we will get something maybe into our protocols of getting that bit's right. So if that's, so can you confirm that that's quite clear? What I'm not clear about is the review will end up amongst you officers, worthy people as you are, but it will go to London councils and leaders. Actually, should it not have a bit of a wider hearing and be looked at a bit more in detail? Are you going to test it on members of the public or potential survivors of different incidences? Do you know what I mean? What you know, how do we get this out of our arenas into other arenas for a double check? If once you've come to a set of decisions and what they could be. And I just want to know that. I'm beginning to think that one of the things that we ought to do is once you come into looking at those changes, both whether it's London councils or our resilience group collectively, we bring it back into this forum and we go through with some checks and criteria that we've had from the discussions we've had with you. I think that would be a worthy piece of work that we could do. Maybe we could sit back with, maybe we could do that jointly with colleagues in local government, maybe not because it all gets too bloody difficult. But we just get on with it because, but equally unclear, that are you going to make changes quickly in the event of another emergency, that we're not going to wait for London Council's decisions to do it. If something is not quite right, that somewhere where there is some consensus amongst the professionals and experts and are coming together, that those that we can go away from this meeting today, Londoners, if they're listening or picking up on this tomorrow, will understand that actually we've done some quick changes here because we think it's appropriate and we're going to take a longer term view on the others because that's the way it is. What's the quick changes that will make a difference in terms of what lessons learned?
I can start at the last one and go forward and then colleagues can comment. I think Doug said something earlier that is really important, that there isn't a chief executive in the country that has not asked and talked to one of us about experiences and what it means for them. So to answer your question directly, yes, it would be different because I think the colleagues at the end of the phone would understand the implications of saying, I'm okay, we can manage, because they know at scale they can't. So there is a bit of reassurance about that. The full reassurance, I suspect, will come with the review. The review, I think, needs to go as well to the London Resiliency Forum, which therefore, of course, because it's managed under a deputy mayoral system, will come back, no doubt, to your committee here, should that be one that you wish to look at, because it has implications for other agencies as well within the partnership. So it isn't only a private piece, and it's not intended to be kept private, otherwise the lessons can't be learned. I'll take away the point around other groups to be involved and comment. No doubt, and I would hope, Grenfell United, among others, would wish to comment on it to see if it addresses some of the concerns that they've had on how responsiveness works. I see no reason absolutely not to do that, and we'll take away and look at other public fora, for an example.
Just remind me of the timescales, what we
February. It gets reported to the leaders in February.
February onwards. Okay.
But that wouldn't stop any lessons being done today, I can assure you.
Okay, and in terms of the issues you said about training and the cadre of officers we need to do and cascade that down, what are the accelerators can we do to that? Because it seems to me that one of the issues is testing and training is what we've learned that it works, it makes sense, but how do we get that across, not just in terms of boroughs, in terms of other agencies, but also some of those other agencies on the patch. We've not talked about the role of the housing associations and them stepping up to where they're, in terms of their role in emergency planning. What do we need to strengthen that? Have we got enough legislation that that's right? Should we be asking government that, in times of woe, that there's a clearer demarcation and what the expectation of these other agencies that are delivering important services in our borough, but they also have capacity. I thought that was a telling point maybe in this situation around immediate capacity on the night that their emergency plans needed to kick in terms of the tenants, their tenants in this case, albeit it was a borough crisis. So what's your thinking about that? And because that isn't going to go to the review group, or is that going to be part of that? What's your thinking through that? What do we need to do?
So I think that speaks to two things. One, and David may want to comment on the governance side and the involvement you've had with reviews from civil contingencies and so on. The second piece on our review of what went on here, because of the public inquiry, clearly that has impacted on our ability to do the full debriefing of lessons learned, going back and seeing who did what, when and why. But it hasn't stopped the process of looking forward. The complication here is a fire brigade are undertaking that process. That is due to happen. On the training of the 7 chief executives, I think we had our first bit of that last week actually, so that's started. That's being supported by the Met and the fire brigade as well, so that's ongoing, and the colleagues have identified themselves who are doing that. There are, besides housing association, I'll draw attention to another one. One of the areas we spotted, it's fairly obvious really, is the involvement of the private sector, particularly the hotel sector. Because in the system there will not be the capacity, I'd suggest, as Barry alluded to, of vacant properties, voids in the system anyway. Even if there were, they wouldn't necessarily be furnished or available for use. So one of the things we're looking at is a system whereby we could have access directly to the hotel chains to understand capacity in that for emergency accommodation, for example. That worked well when we spoke to the chief executives of the individual firms. No one refused to help with this. Okay? But ringing a chief exec, suddenly things happen, which is really helpful. But there's some lessons around that, and similarly for other private sector and other organisations who could help. And that's part of our debriefing and learning process. Not the review, I agree, Chair, it's slightly different.
And maybe you could write back to us about you intend to take things that are outside the review, but it seemed to me just as important, really, in terms of going forward of how things would work. And I suppose, in terms of structures of where we are where we are. We're working within the legislation framework. I think there is a perception, and there is perceptions of leadership, whether they're powers or not, that there is an expectation on the mayor, because the mayor is a position, there's a expectation that we understand the delivery is with local government, and that's probably the best place for it around on those issues. What worries me, and what worries me about a public inquiry, is that it will seem to be need to do something, and we end up, sadly, what really made me aware of this situation, I've got nothing against government. I think government is quite important and has a crucial role. I don't need to be told by government when something is going wrong. There's something about the feds coming in and thinking another layer over. So I'm waiting for some bright spark to say, what we need to do is just change these, rearrange these deck chairs and bring in a national emergency organisation. I want to resist that personally. I can't speak for others around the table. But what's the arguments against that, considering what happened? What's the arguments against that? Give me the arguments. I'm on your side. I want to be able to say that back, and I want to be able to rebut that. Because I think, I'm a great believer, if mistakes are made, you learn by them, and you take it and get a grip, and you make sure you minimise it, or they don't ever happen again. And I think, much that there's some issues about culpability here and whatever, it reflects on the local government family. And by that, I think the GLA is part of that local government family. It might be a regional body, so it reflects on us all. So what's the arguments I do to say, no, resist that? This is a tried, tested, yet some things we got right, some things we didn't get quite right, and we're going to make sure we do it. So what's the arguments?
There are 3, I think. One of them is, and we picked this up as part of that review and implementation piece, was about where emergency planning and resilience sits within the attention span of leading members and chief officers and chief executives. And I think the experience of those of us involved and those of us not involved in Grenfell and the tragedy there has said, you better take this seriously because it is very serious business. And that is important because that then dictates airspace, time, money, effort, and the best talent that we've got taking this seriously and getting involved in it. So that's the first defence, as it were, the seriousness with which it's taken. The second one is the understanding that this is a collaborative and collegiate piece. No one organisation has all the expertise. You heard about Harrow and Barry and Barry's comment about Mike Lockwood's team. We have to share, we have to understand what is there and who is available to be used. The third one is empowerment, and it doesn't matter which organisation you're from, it's having the support, understanding and knowledge of others and who can do the job. It happened, those of us around this table happened to be around at the time. We've got to make sure the capacity is in the system so that the resilience is, it's not only us, others can do it, and that was the point of the 7. Why not a national one? Because local solutions are needed. The lesson from here is understanding local community, the needs of individual victims and survivors is what makes the difference to them, not some grand plan sitting on a shelf that someone can take and execute. Back to your earlier point about, write it in a way it's accessible. That all speaks against Thunderbirds, if I can call it that. It speaks to local people, local resiliency, actually on a street level. And one of the things we've been talking about in the Resiliency Forum is how to get communities being resilient themselves, which means the volunteers that stepped up and worked actually doing it in their own communities themselves. Not for any money-saving reason, but simply it is the way to get support into local communities. And that's the switch we're trying to do.
In those circumstances.
Exactly.
Right, I get that. And I suppose the last question to you all, the role of Lord Harris's review, you have to remind me about exactly what he said, but he said appoint a chief resilience officer. Could be a title, could be an individual, depending on the workload and what that is. So what's the thinking of the Mayor's office on that, and where do you think it would help in terms of the coordination aspect of some of the work? What's the thinking on it?
So the background.
Because I'm looking at one. I'm thinking I'm looking at one of them in front of me. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
In terms of that. But
the background to that is that the Rockefeller Foundation have an organisation called 100 Resilient Cities, and they go around basically offering funding for a limited period of time and advocating for cities to have a chief resilience officer. And what that is about for them is, yes, there's something about response to sudden emergencies, but a lot of it is actually about the policy thinking necessary for rising tide situations, and that might be thinking decades ahead about flooding risk, for example, or it could be thinking very long term about the risks to a city's success if the housing market gets out of control, things like that. And that is their perspective, and it's kind of that proposal that I think Lord Harris reflected in, I think it's recommendation number 127 of his 127 recommendations. Now, clearly looking at that, London has significant aspects of that. We have a London Resilience Operation, which is very strong, has been through a lot of things. Clearly there are always going to be things to learn, and we've discussed particular aspects of that today. And also we have, unlike many cities where they have city government, which is a lot about emptying the bins and providing those services, here the GLA is designed to be more strategic and think about some of those longer term questions. So we're maybe not quite in the same place as other cities. Nonetheless, I think there is something to this, and we are looking at this. As I touched on earlier, we have, and now it looks pretty likely that from next April, LFIPA will be abolished and the Office of the London Fire Commissioner will be introduced. And what that means is the creation of a post for Deputy Mayor Fire. And it's quite likely that that person will also get asked to oversee the resilience operation, and then through that, we'll have that tie-in, given that London Resilience is based out of the Fire Brigade. So really, we've been looking to get more clarity as we make that appointment. look at, right, do we actually need a new Chief Resilience Officer? Is this an evolution of a post perhaps that already exists, and it's actually more about more subtle changes that go with that governance change? But that's absolutely something that we're considering alongside ourselves as an authority, just recognising our own internal capability to respond to incidents and the police advice, broaden this to look at the terrorist threat, that what we've seen in recent months is not a temporary spike in attacks, but actually it's a shift in the threat pattern, and sadly we can expect that to continue in future.
We might write you further on that, because it might be something that is worth pursuing in terms of raising the profile of our response, and there, whether it's another title, but where I was more thinking, rather than Politico, I was thinking more of an expert.
Exactly, Chair. That's the point. Is the political
okay.
leadership, and then the expertise underneath that, and that's what the Mayor's response to Lord Harris's report sets out. So you may wish to review that.
What we're going to do now is go back and look at the transcripts in the way that you've answered the questions. Also re-examine what we did in the past, and we probably will be writing to you all and respective bodies that you do. And I suppose the last thing I do want to say, look, like I say, the reality of what happened in this terrible tragedy is that there was some good work done, but equally there was some poor work done, and that had a greater impact on those survivors and victims of the tragedy. What we need to be clear on is that we're going to minimise it or stop something bad happening in the future in terms of that recovery response. That's what we're going to focus on. We'll come back to you. I really do feel at this thing, and on behalf of the committee, is look, whatever may have gone wrong in Grenfell, we ought to thank you for the work that you do. And I realise there's loads of people that are not in this room, but you're their representatives around some of this emergency work. I've always been surprised on a number of occasions how that local government family comes into play. This is official, but equally I know about some of the informal side where authorities get into difficulty, where people rally around with different expertise. So I think we should, on reflection, albeit these are difficult times and questions do need to be raised and answers found around on them, we should thank you for that work that you have done in the past and will do so in the future. So I just want to say that. Thank you very much. We will come back to you. Yeah, thank you. Right, colleagues, we've briefly got some work to do, still to continue on as our guests leave. If we can go back to the main items. So let's move on to item 6, IT shared services for the LBDC. Is there any questions you want to ask of officers? Okay.
Sorry.
Is there any we're recommended to respond. Is there any response that the committee wants to give? We should just note.
Yeah, I'm assuming we're making money out of this.
Yeah. Well, that'll be the next one. Saving money. Yeah. Okay, moving on to item 7, proposed changes to the GLA establishment policy, programme policy services. No, we're not going to have you introduce the report. Are there any questions for the officer? No. There is an error in the report. What's the error?
Yeah, apologies for the error. That due to a miscount and also including the estates team, which have since moved across to TfL on a shared services basis, it should say the current complement is 108 and these changes increase it to 117.
Okay. So are there any responses to this? This is the establishment in the changes to the establishment in the Housing and Land Directorate. I think arose out of the budget issues going through, and it's about increasing capacity.
No, but just to say, appreciated all the diagrams because they will become useful in future.
No doubt they'll change next week. Item 8, work programme for the GLA Oversight Committee. We can discuss that offline. Can we just note that? But we should add, I think we need to find some time in. I think we do want to look at the review that comes back. I think we need to find some time for that. think that through.
Chair, can we do it before it goes formally to London Council? Is there any chance of that? Because otherwise it's just rubber stamped. You know, we're talking about something that's already been rubber stamped. Maybe you could talk to Claire about that.
I wonder if we could explore informally. Is there see, I'm not sure it's commissioned by London councils. They report back to London councils. I think it's been commissioned out of the forum. So it's quite interesting where it should go to and who it should go to.
Is it the EP 2020 review? Because that has started before Grenfell happened.
No, I think this is a different
This
one.
is a separate, because there's also the EP 2020 review, and there'll be further reports of the task force.
Can you allow me to explore further with officers, and let's get to the bottom of that. Yeah?
In addition to what we've just heard, there were a number of questions that weren't answered because there was no data. Can we just make sure that we're going to really follow up and make sure that we get some, especially out of K&C, and the minutes for the meetings?
We're definitely going to follow up.
It's very difficult to form a picture.
We know they're with the map at the moment for clearance. We just need to chase that. Okay, moving on then. 9. Date of next meeting, 14th of December 2017. At 10 a.m. in the chamber. Oh, yeah, we're in the chamber. Okay, can we note that? I've got no. Oh, there is a one supplementary item. Other business the chair considers urgent. This is to do with. Remind me.
This is to do with the change from LFIPA to the London Fire Commissioner and ensuring that the officer who becomes London Fire Commissioner can access the firefighters' pension scheme.
We can support that.
Yes, we
correcting the anomaly.
Can we agree that? Okay, thank you very much. That being the end of the meeting, can I thank you for that? It was very lovely, but very important we did it. Thank you very much.
GLA Committee Room 5,